Hello, welcome to my Cubase course. I honestly think this could be the best course for you to learn. I put a lot of work in it, and actually I'm going to produce a track along with you. So this is going to be very comprehensive. I will publish on YouTube lots of episodes, but the full 13-hour course is on Udemy. Just please use the link below. It's a referral link because this is actually the only way I can earn a decent amount of the price. Otherwise, majority of the price is taken away by other entities. So please use the link to Udemy and have fun. Oh, by the way, I used AI to translate the course because I originally recorded it in Polish, but I hope you like this American English voiceover. It would just take ages to translate 13-hour course, so I hope you like it, and let's start.
Hello everyone, I invite you to watch my most comprehensive and largest course to date, 3-in-1. While we go through almost every area of this program in great and thorough detail, we'll also create a track together. So don't let this large-scale project scare you. We're going to build it in very small and manageable steps. I'll show you first of all exactly how to start the setup and how to begin recording. I'll be using this fantastic synthesizer right here, the Arturia Mini Freak, and using these specifically recorded audio parts as an example. We'll cover absolutely everything about audio editing and the various essential technical skills you need to produce your projects at a professional level. Of course, we'll also talk about how to locate samples, how to import them, how to process them, where to find them, and exactly where files are saved. So you can keep track of everything from the start and have total control. For those of you who sing or rap, you'll definitely be interested to know there's a large section dedicated specifically to vocals. In addition to vocal processing and correction, I'll demonstrate for you how to perform pitch correction and how to successfully achieve specific vocal effects like this one. We'll also cover creating harmonies that stay in key, so I think there's a lot of really cool stuff, all within the context of using effects in the mixer. In addition to that, we'll also discuss how to create and edit MIDI data, as well as controller tracks and automation, because that's also an absolutely essential component of modern professional music production. We'll also talk about how to process various types of loops or how to actually create loops, using the samples already included within the project, much like what we see in this case, for example. There will also be a large section dedicated to the control room and mixing using commercial recordings because, look, I started from a point like this. To achieve a result like this. There will also be a lot to cover, listen, about various special effects, like processing tempo, working with time signatures, transposition, and also using additional samples and processing them offline. Here is a specialized section where I've employed various offline operations. So I'll show you those specific steps as well, because it's an essential aspect of working with this program that can make your compositions absolutely unparalleled. You'll be able to use a wide variety of different creative effects, really. I am sitting back against the door. I can hear your laugh resonate behind that door. You don't even see me when she's there. I could disappear, you wouldn't even care. Wait, got me, I'm addicted to you. There will be a lot of information about the built-in effects processors, which I'll discuss in detail using several practical examples. I'll be using many new elements that weren't there before. We'll cover reverb effects, plugins, and also compressors and new tools. So I think you'll be very satisfied with this course. And in the last part, more about the transposition effect itself. Anyway, listen to how it sounds now. In order to install Cubase, you're going to need to download what's called the Download Assistant. We launch the downloaded file and proceed with its installation. Of course, we have to accept the terms of the agreements. When you run Steinberg Download Assistant for the first time, it automatically updates itself, which also applies to the eLicenser software. Next, in the Steinberg Download Assistant, we select My Product Downloads in Cubase 12 or Cubase Pro 12. Here are the other versions. And as for Cubase Pro 12, as you can see, we have a huge number of add-ons available. First of all, of course, we need to install a program, and then we decide which of these add-ons to install, or we can install all of them. But first, they are downloaded to the drive in the location we specify. And of course, we can change this location if, for example, we don't have much space on the C drive. For example, I will decide to choose a different location for myself. Let's say it will be Drive H, where I have relatively a lot of space. And notice, in the settings, we can also change this setting at any time, and it doesn't affect files that have already been downloaded. We can also limit the number of files being downloaded at the same time, for example, to 5. Of course, you should install the program, and the remaining add-ons are optional and can be selected as you wish. However, keep in mind that some of them are simply content for selected instruments. So, without, for example, a virtual instrument, there's no point in installing content for it. Everything here is described quite nicely, so I'll just install what I think I'll need for recording this course. Oh, and if you download something, of course you can delete it from the selected location at any time. For example, like this. So I'm moving on to the installation. The software components I selected have been installed automatically. And now, when I press the button with the Windows symbol and type in Cubase, you'll notice that version 12 is already installed on my system, and I can launch the program. To activate the program, you need to log in. And that's it. So once again, I'm launching the program. In the new version of Cubase, there's a new start screen called the Cubase Hub. Here you'll find all the projects you've worked on recently, as well as various templates you can use to start working. Take a look. So we have the recent category, which simply contains all the projects we've worked on lately, as well as templates, new patterns you can start from if you want to produce, for example, music in the style of classic house, low-heat hip-hop, or neo-soul. Notice the different icons, whether it's a project or an empty one. A mastering project has a speaker icon. Also, notice that there's one additional folder here, Cubase Project, which I added myself in the settings. Haba, meaning Hub Settings. Here, by clicking the button with the plus symbol, that is the Add User Location command, I can simply point to a folder on my drive where I store my projects. Of course, you can have more of these folders, then I can also specify their locations. So if I want it to appear at the end, all I have to do is use these little arrows. So, as you can clearly see, my current default storage location is specifically set to the Cubase Projects folder located on my local D drive partition. If I don't enter a name here, every newly created empty project will be labeled as untitled, but I can, for example, enter the name New Project, and then every project I create will have that name, possibly with a numerical suffix. If I also select the option to display project paths and descriptions, then each project will show its path and each template will display its description. The other buttons in the Cubase Pro Hub take us to the internet. So, for example, under the Tutorials button, you'll find a few tutorials recommended by the manufacturer, Tous Royale. Maybe more will appear in the future, and maybe one day my own tutorial will show up here too, since I also record in English. Here, under the Deals link, we have a page with any current promotions. Right now, it says that there are no promotions at the moment. And we can also easily go to the manual by simply selecting User Manual. Notice that now we can open the full manual either as Cubase Pro Help, which is available online like this, and, for example, by specifically typing in Project Hub into the search bar, you can find a detailed description of this particular window. But you can also open the manual as a PDF, which is the operation manual.
And here as well, either by searching for text or by finding the hub here on page 120, you get a full description of what the Cubase hub is. Under the tab Mine Steinberg, you'll find, once you're logged in, information about all your products as well as their possible expiration dates, in the case of journalist licenses like the ones I have, or depending on the type of protection. There are also two very important new features in the new Cubase hub. First of all, we can immediately select the audio output we want to use. Take a look. Here we have the basic driver settings. And I suggest using the ASIO driver here, especially on PC computers. So, audio stream input output. And here, of course, we can choose the output to which our headphones or studio monitors are connected. And with this button, we can check if they're connected properly.
The left channel, the right channel.
Additionally, under this icon, you'll find detailed settings. As you can see, my interface has been set up to work with a sample rate of 48 kilohertz and a buffer size of 512 samples. These are, in fact, the requirements of the Dolby Atmos rack. I often mix in this format, so that's why I use these settings. However, for production, I usually recommend setting a smaller buffer so that the latency is as low as possible. That way, when you hit the keyboard or pads, you won't hear any delay at all. The sound will appear instantly. Typically, you achieve this when the latency is less than, say, 5 to 7 milliseconds. The second new feature, Cubase Pro Hub now has project previews. Notice that when I expand this list now, some projects have a little icon with a play symbol next to them.
You're tired, but girl, I'm so wired. Oh no.
It usually contains a short preview of the project, think about 5 seconds long. This one is actually a demonstration of the vocal chain's capabilities, which I cover in detail in one of the episodes of my Cubase from Scratch course. It's about half an hour long. But I also have a preview, for example, from a project I recently made while reviewing one of the Excite audio plugins from the Bloom series. So maybe I'll open up that project so you can see what it looks like. So this section was actually used as a preview. Previews are created when you select Project, Project Preview, and then hit Create. You can also check the option to create these previews when you close the project. All right, so maybe I'll move the cursor to a different spot, to a denser part, like right here. Let's see. So I'm going back to Project Preview, Set Preview, Start the Cursor. So I set it here, and now I can create the preview. That means I select the Project Preview Create function. The program's creating the preview. And right now, at this point, when I go ahead and close the project using the standard Close File and Close Project function, a prompt will appear asking me for confirmation whether I want to save this project, and I have to save it so that the preview gets saved with the project. So I choose Save, and now look, back to the Cubase Pro Hub, and now we have a new preview. So the preview was recorded exactly from the spot where I placed the cursor. And of course, if we want to open a different project than the one already created here, we can simply select it from the disk using the Choose File function, or create a new project by choosing the Create Empty option, which means create an empty project. And as a reminder, where this project will be created and under what name is set in the settings. So here, the default location and default name, if none is entered, the project will be titled Untitled. And that's basically it. We can also usually enter the name ourselves. So I click Create Project, and since it's currently untitled, I can only enter the name by saving it. But I'll cover that in more detail later in the course. If you're just starting out with this program, don't skip this episode.
I want to share a few important things here about configuring your audio interface. The audio interface is one of the most important devices in practically any sound workshop or music studio, even in large ones. There's always some kind of audio interface. We connect it to the computer, and then we hook up speakers, microphones, instruments, or headphones to it. This one here is the RME Babyface Pro FS model. You'll find the audio settings in the Studio menu. Select Studio Setup. The most important settings are in the Audio System tab right here. If the interface you want to use with the program isn't listed here, you need to select it from this list. All of these settings you see here are really about managing power and the resulting latency you have to take into account. Because for the computer to process or generate sound in real time, it has to do some calculations. And as you can see right now, the input latency is just under about 6 milliseconds. The output latency is also just under 7 milliseconds. So what exactly does that mean? Output latency is the specific amount of time that passes from a message, let's say a MIDI message, so physically pressing down a key on the keyboard, to the moment the sound is triggered by the computer, for example through some virtual instrument. However, if you plan to process sound from a microphone, a guitar, or some external hardware instrument through effects within the software itself, you need to add together the input and output latency, and then these settings start to matter much more, because we cross that barrier of 7 or 10 milliseconds, and the delay starts to become noticeable and perceptible. We'll hear it in the headphones, it'll be harder for us to sing, and so on and so forth. It'll be harder to play. Therefore, it's worth going into the interface settings itself and opening the so-called control panel. In the case of RME, it looks like this. And then select and specify the latency, or more precisely, set the buffer size in samples. That is, the amount of time you give the computer to perform all these calculations. I usually choose 128 or 256 because the resulting output latency when using virtual instruments is then 4 to 7 milliseconds for me, so I practically don't notice it. I can play rhythms, and it works just fine. If I'm mixing or mastering, I usually increase that buffer to 1,000 or even 2,000 samples. That way, the computer doesn't have to work as hard. Any fluctuations aren't as drastic, and it has more time to process everything and so on. So if you plan to process sound in real time, choose a small buffer. Most modern interfaces can easily handle small buffers. There are even interfaces that work with a 16-sample buffer. But of course, not all interfaces are created equal. Some interfaces running at 32 samples have higher latency than my interface at 64 samples, so it's not that easy to compare. You have to experiment for yourselves. But the Cubase system is equipped with a highly specialized and efficient ASIO guard system, which in fact effectively works to bypass and eliminate these limitations because it allows us to work with a very large number of virtual instruments simultaneously, and only those that we are currently playing or using for real-time processing will use that lowest possible latency buffer settings. All of the other remaining background processes can simply use the ASIO guard system instead. We can only use ASIO guard if we enable multiprocessing. This is basically a mandatory option. Most processors are now multi-core, and still, of course, if we place instruments on a single track, we usually load just one core, one processor thread. But what we put on the next track is usually distributed among the next cores, the next threads of our processor. So this option is mandatory. And if we enable multiprocessing, we can also turn on ASIO guard. Now, as you can clearly see here, ASIO guard introduces a bit of extra processing latency, which is primarily noticeable when pressing the play button or moving a fader. This will be a minimal delay that we won't hear, and it doesn't affect the use of virtual instruments. So it's a really well-organized system. Here, we can also further increase what's called the overall level of this specific protection. The higher it is, the more reliable and stable the system should be. But, of course, the latency can increase and memory usage can also go up. The program itself, especially when it comes to laptops, allows us to enable the high-performance power plan. For desktop computers, there's basically no need to turn on this option. There's also the release driver when application is in background option. In theory, this is meant to release drivers so they can be used by other applications, even if we're using Cubase. In practice, however, I've noticed that there's no need to check this box, and sometimes enabling this option actually has the opposite effect than intended. So be careful, if something isn't working outside of Cubase, try enabling this function. If everything's already working, just leave it disabled. Regarding audio priority, of course, if you happen to hear any unusual crackling or digital artifacts during your audio playback, you can try manually increasing the priority of the audio processing. And right here, we also have several additional functions related specifically to the recording offset. If, for example, you're recording sound from a drum machine and there are some timing shifts during recording and you don't know what's causing them, you can try adjusting them here. And here we have the automation recording precision. I also suggest leaving it unchanged. Oh, and of course, we can also choose between 32-bit or 64-bit internal processing. I suggest using 64-bit processing if you have a 64-bit processor, of course. It's actually redundant, but in the case of very dense arrangements, maybe there will be a slight difference in the tails, in the reverb tails, in how the sound is processed. So it's worth taking full advantage of that 64-bit processing potential. If you mess some up, just click Reset. These default settings are usually the best. In the interface settings themselves, meaning in the sub-tab for the interface, we just select which of its physical inputs and outputs we want to use with the program. For example, if you're not hooking up any external gear to the so-called ADAT inputs, oh, you can't see them here on camera, you can easily go ahead and deactivate all these inputs like this. They just will no longer appear in the list when you're selecting the output for a specific individual track. External. External synchronization with the clock and direct monitoring. I'll be sure to cover that when we get to the audio recording. The last thing is the sampling rate. This is usually selected in the interface settings or somewhere globally in the system. Right now, it's set to 44.1 kHz, and that frequency is more than sufficient for professional work. Most plugins and most audio processors actually process sound internally with oversampling, which means they operate at twice the standard or even 4 times the precision. That's the case, for example, with PSP AudioWare plugins, which I really like. So there's no need to increase the sample rate when working with instruments or plugins. Some virtual instruments, like Native Instruments, Reactor, or those created in the Reactor system, work this way as well. There, too, we set the processing frequency, so to speak, the frequency at which the sound is generated. So the sample rate itself doesn't affect that. However, it does have a direct impact on what we record as audio. So if you want to make audiophile quality recordings of instruments, for example, acoustic ones, then increasing the sample rate, say to 96 kilohertz in the case of multi-track recording, might give you a slight improvement in sound quality, so it's worth experimenting. Naturally, it is important to note that if you're doing something for radio or television where the systems operate at a frequency of 48 kilohertz, it is generally considered best practice to select 48 kilohertz right from the start. Although any losses from resampling or changing the sample rate at the mixing stage are so incredibly minor and subtle that they're virtually impossible for the human ear to notice. But of course, it's better to set that target frequency right here from the start. And there's one last thing related to this. By increasing the sampling rate, you're actually increasing the load on your computer. If you go up to 88 kilohertz, you could basically say it doubles. Latency drops then, but the computer has to work much harder. So that's just how it works. You could just as well lower the buffer when working at 44 or increase the sampling rate. In both cases, latency will also drop. In fact, the computer will be loaded about the same in both scenarios, more or less. Hi, in the previous episode I explained how to best set up an audio interface for work. This time we'll talk about MIDI and MIDI controllers. As you can clearly see in my studio setup, there are many different electronic devices connected to the computer, all of which serve exactly this particular purpose. In professional recording studios all over the world, computers have truly taken on the crucial role not only of multi-track audio recorders, but also of instruments, samplers, audio processors, and all kinds of other musical devices you can possibly imagine. And the primary and most effective way to control them is still MIDI. What exactly is it?
MIDI, or Musical Instrument Digital Interface, is a comprehensive digital protocol for efficiently exchanging information between various musical devices. It covers not only essential note messages, but also allows for smooth and precise changes of various parameters and even recalling entire sets of settings and configurations. Introduced in 1983, this remarkable system is still very widely used today and remains the primary method for precisely controlling synthesizers, samplers, drum machines, digital mixers, and many other diverse musical devices.
The primary use of MIDI is to effectively utilize messages generated in real time, for example, while playing a keyboard instrument, or those meticulously recorded in a computer program to precisely play musical parts on equipped electronic instruments. This occurs in so-called MIDI input systems, fully supporting MIDI technology. These can be sophisticated synthesizers, dedicated sound modules, but also versatile virtual instruments running seamlessly within a computer environment.
Thanks to the widespread and extensive implementation of MIDI in most hardware instruments, digital audio workstation programs and hardware sequencers can be effectively used to control multiple instruments simultaneously and to synchronize the musical sequences they play. MIDI is also used to control digital consoles and audio processors both in the studio and in live concert settings. Most MIDI input and output ports typically use 5-pin DIN connectors, while in smaller, more compact devices, they are often replaced with 1/8-inch TRS connectors, to which MIDI cables are then connected via an appropriate adapter. Many modern MIDI devices that connect directly to a computer do not actually have dedicated MIDI connectors, and MIDI messages are instead transmitted via USB. The development of music creation software, see the definition of DAW, Digital Audio Workstation, has resulted in a market where there are now a great many, and probably even more, MIDI controllers, meaning devices that generate only MIDI messages. Then there are devices that actually generate sound, such as hardware synthesizers.
If you want to use a MIDI connection, you need to make sure that your interface is equipped with MIDI ports. In front of me is the Machine MK3, a controller dedicated to software of the same name, which is both an audio interface and, importantly, a MIDI interface, because it has MIDI in and MIDI out ports. We connect instruments and keyboards to it using these 5-pin MIDI plugs, like this cable here, for example. In the case of the RME Babyface Pro interface, the MIDI port is implemented with a non-standard connector, to which we connect a so-called breakout cable, and here we have standard MIDI input and output clearly marked on the cables. Some hardware instruments also have MIDI implemented on TRS 1/8-inch connectors, the so-called mini jack, and in that case, such cables are included with them. Let me show you a close-up. You just need to make sure if you're buying them separately that it's the correct standard, because there are two, A or B. As you saw, basically all the devices in my studio are connected to the computer via USB cable. And MIDI communication, a crucial aspect of digital music, takes place in both directions through a single, convenient USB connection. However, if you happen to have more hardware devices, or if you specifically want to connect a keyboard, an instrument, or a synthesizer to your computer using the standard MIDI protocol, then you will definitely need to connect the output of such an instrument to the input of this particular type on the audio interface. So MIDI connects this specific cable to the input of the interface. So, for working with Cubase's onboard instruments, specifically the virtual ones, you'll definitely want to use either some kind of small MIDI keyboard via USB, a dedicated synthesizer via MIDI acting as a USB keyboard, or perhaps a larger, for example, a professional MIDI keyboard for comprehensive control and enhanced musical playability. Let's move on to the settings in the program. You'll find the MIDI settings in the Studio menu. Under the Studio Setup tab, in the Studio Setup window, you will need to carefully find the dedicated MIDI tab, and within it, the specific MIDI port setup section. Here, all of your MIDI devices that are currently connected to your computer should clearly appear, including both your audio interfaces and any controllers that are connected to the computer via standard USB cables. As you can see, in my case, there are quite a few of them. The first on the list was Ableton Push, a controller dedicated to operating Ableton. At the moment, it's working with Ableton running in the background, but you just need to switch it to user mode by pressing Shift User. And now, when I press a pad, you'll notice a bouncing meter appears in the bottom right corner of the interface. This clearly means that the MIDI signal is coming in through our input connection here. The very same principle applies to another controller that is dedicated to a different program, which, when switched into MIDI mode using the shift channel function, will then send regular MIDI messages, and this will also be clearly indicated here in the bottom right corner of the display. A MIDI keyboard controller. This might be the first thing you'll want to buy if you're thinking about making music on your computer. Why? Let me explain.
A MIDI keyboard controller is essentially a device equipped with a musical keyboard, which is primarily used to generate electronic signals for controlling other musical devices via MIDI, USB, or Bluetooth connections. It's most commonly utilized to play virtual instruments or sound modules. Very often, MIDI keyboard controllers are also equipped with pads for triggering rhythms, buttons for controlling selected DAW functions, as well as knobs or sliders. As a rule, the term MIDI keyboard controller refers to devices that do not generate any sounds themselves. They only send MIDI messages.
Why did I say that a MIDI keyboard controller might be one of the first things worth buying? That's because many MIDI keyboard controllers come with a rich software bundle, including basic versions of various DAW programs. Let's pause here for a moment. The choice of software can also be a criterion for choosing a keyboard or interface, because some devices come with a Cubase LE version, which sometimes can, for example, give you the option to purchase the full version at a slightly lower price. And so, for example, Cubase LE is bundled with Steinberg products, Yamaha, Audient interfaces, and a range of other products, sometimes Tascam, for example, recorders, so it's worth checking that. Let's try going to the settings for a moment. As you can see, MIDI inputs appear first on the list, so each controller is usually visible as an input. Let's take the Microlab keyboard as an example, but also as an output. Look here in the I/O section, meaning input-output. Input-output shows up for us, and this keyboard and Ableton Push and all the other controllers. Theoretically, it might seem that it's enough to select the MIDI input, since, for example, you only intend to play on the keyboard. Oh, here, for example, some melody is not visible. Sometimes this feedback is necessary, for example, to display some information on the controller so that the communication is two-way. This is especially important in the case of endless-type controllers, where there is no beginning or end. You can turn the knob endlessly within the range. To make things even more complicated, some specific devices can sometimes really appear on the list, as 3 distinct individual inputs or as 3 separate outputs. A perfect example is the Complete Control keyboard, that large keyboard which I'll show you up close in a moment. Complete Control 1, External, and DAW. What is this for? The Complete Control keyboard appears 3 times on the MIDI ports list, and not without reason. First of all, it works as a regular MIDI keyboard, so you can simply play on it. Secondly, it also supports a host application for plugins compatible with the NKS standard. So with this keyboard, you can browse presets of those instruments and launch them, as well as change their various individual parameters in real time. And thirdly, you can effectively control the fundamental and basic parameters of the mixer itself, such as the overall volume, stereo panning, and also manage the transport section, specifically play, record, stop, and other essential functions like solo and mute themselves. I would just like to additionally add that in order to effectively control the mixer and transport functions within Cubase, you specifically need to select the Complete Control DAW input and output options in the Remote Devices section. So you would then proceed to Remote Devices and carefully add the Complete Control keyboard. After successfully adding it, you will need to select Complete Control DAW1 as the designated input and Complete Control DAW as the corresponding output. And as you can clearly see now, the various buttons on the keyboard conveniently control the functions that are precisely listed here. Another particularly interesting example could be the Microlab keyboards, which allow us to easily change presets within the Analog Lab application, where all the fully functional versions of the brand's instruments are actively running in the background.
Keyboards from Arturia and Native Instruments additionally offer integration with software, allowing us to launch selected instruments, change presets, and also adjust predefined parameters. In the case of Arturia keyboards, the integration covers V-Collection series instruments launched within the Analog Lab application, while for Native Instruments keyboards, starting from the smallest M32 model, it includes all instruments compatible with the NKS standard, that is Native Control Standard. The full list can be found on the Native Instruments website.
So, as you can clearly see, in the comprehensive list of MIDI input and output ports, we can readily find both various physical controllers that are directly connected to the computer via a reliable USB cable, as well as the dedicated physical ports of an audio interface, such as my personal RME Babyface Pro FS, along with virtual ports specifically designed for handling certain essential DAW program functions, but also entirely virtual MIDI ports that exist purely in software form. Free software likes this as it allows us, for example, to route MIDI signals from Cubase to another computer application if such a need arises. As you may have noticed, all MIDI ports are marked as visible by default. These are both MIDI in and out ports, patch, section, visible. What does this actually mean? It means that we can precisely designate any of these available ports as the primary input for effectively handling a given virtual instrument on a specific MIDI track, for example, this particular one. But we can also choose the all MIDI input option, and then the instrument will respond to messages coming from all controllers that we mark in the in all MIDI section, which is right here. Let's just take a look at the lower part of this window. If you are using any devices that rely on direct music drivers, check this option. If you are utilizing devices such as Bluetooth MIDI devices, then it is recommended to select the appropriate Windows RT option. If you experience any potential issues or difficulties, such as significant timing delays, for example, during performance or recording, of notes during recording, etc., you can try enabling the Use System Timestamp option for each of these types of devices. And that will probably be all for this episode. Of course, these are just the absolute basics. There are many more settings available. For example, you can set up 8 distinct macros on each track and then choose a controller that has at least 8 dedicated controls. Potentiometers or encoders, like the endless type, for example, the MIDI Fighter Twister. There's a separate episode about it on my website, which I highly recommend. It's a super creative controller with several different operating modes for the knobs, including push functionality and a variety of modes. I don't want to spend time on that now. Besides that, the Launchpad also shows how to use the Launchpad, for example, to trigger various, not MIDI messages, but for example, to process inserts in Cubase. You can also find this in the Mini Remote Setup tab. So that's something I'll probably cover in separate episodes. And the material about the Launchpad in Cubase is also available on my website, somewhere in the test section. I've programmed 3 custom modes for myself, for handling quick controls, for operating the mixer and transport, and for batch processing. Let's start with the mixer. The bottom row is for transport. Maybe let's start from the beginning then, so I'll rewind to the start. Start. I turn the first track to solo mode, then the second track to solo, and the third one as well. I can also mute them like this, take a look. It works really nicely and very efficiently, and of course, if I wanted to lower the volume of a particular audio track, I can easily do that using these dedicated buttons, which effectively act as faders. Notice that when I press them, there seem to be 4 volume levels. The pads light up brighter now, so this adjustment is quite...
Before we move on, I'd like to clearly explain to you how to create projects, how to save them, where their components are stored, how to revert to a previous version, how to transfer data between projects, create backups, and so on and so forth. So let's get started. As I already mentioned, on the left side, you'll find the projects we saved in previous sessions, as well as so-called templates, which are starting points for things like multi-track audio recording, creating sheet music, producing a specific music genre, mastering, and a blank project under the More tab. Of course, it's a good idea to create or specify a folder on your drive where your Cubase projects will be saved. By default, the program names them untitled, without a title, and adds a number. So it's a really good idea, if you already know what you'll be working on, to enter the title here. This will make our work easier. We'll also be able to easily recognize this project on the drive, and so on. So that's a good option, but you can also do it differently, and save the project later under a different name. So let's say I want to create an empty project. I click Create. For example, let's say I'm going to go ahead and make a recording now. So I simply right-click to create a new track. I select the Add Audio Track command. I'll go ahead and create a new mono track. And now I'm going to start the recording process. The lower bar here. Take a look. 1, 2, 3. So now I have the audio recorded. And now I can save my project along with this track, which has been saved in the project folder. I select the File Save or Save As command. The first time I try to save the project, the program will ask me for its name. So I'll call it New Project, and I also recommend adding numbering like 01, 02, 03, up to 99. I usually don't go over that number, so I named this project New Project. And as you may have noticed, there was a subfolder called Audio, where that file was saved. Another useful feature is the ability to go back to a previous version of the project. Let's say we now launch some kind of instrument, for example, the clavinet from Arturia. I would make some changes to this audio track and would like to restore the previous version of the project. Nothing could be easier. From the File menu, I select the File Revert option. The program just asks me to confirm this operation. I choose Revert, and the previous saved version of the project is restored. Images that we can assign to tracks are also saved in the project folder. We can also load our own images from the disk here. I loaded one myself, and now, if I save this project again, you'll notice that in the project folder, maybe I'll use the Shift-S command, a new category called Track Pictures has appeared, and in it, of course, is that image. Another important thing, if you import files directly from the disk, for example, like this, into a specific place in the arrangement window, you'll usually see a dialog box like this one. It's worth checking the option Copy File to Project Folder, which tells the program to copy that file into the project folder. Otherwise, it'll always refer to the original source location. If anything happens to those files, if we delete them or change the folder location, the program won't be able to find them because they won't be in the project folder under the audio subfolder. So I always check this option. If you see any information here indicating that conversion is required, it's a good idea to select it. If you don't do that, the file will likely fail to play back correctly. It might play at half speed, double speed, and so on. Of course, we can also split it into left and right channels. I usually don't do this, and if you don't want the program to ask you every time what to do, you can check the Do Not Ask Again option, and after clicking OK, the file will be imported just as you see. You can then import additional files without being asked. Of course, all of them are saved in the project directory in the audio subfolder. You can change the import and dialog box settings in the Preferences window. Go to the Edit menu, Preferences, then the Editing tab, and select Audio. The function is called OnImport Audio Files, which means what the program should do when importing files. Right now, it copies them to the project directory and converts them to the same resolution we're working with. That is, to our project's resolution. How do you change it? I'll talk about that in the next episode as well. So here, we can select Open Options dialog, and then this window will pop up every time again. Simply go ahead and click on Apply, and then OK. Interestingly, Cubase actually allows us to work seamlessly on several different projects at the same time and provides us with the incredibly useful ability to copy various types of resources between them, which is particularly helpful for moving audio and MIDI clips. I want to show you that now. Now, I'm going to create a new project by selecting the New Project option from the File menu or by using the Control-N keyboard shortcut. This time, it'll be specifically a starter preset for creating dance music. I click Create. The program asks me whether to activate this project, whether this project should be active if this is the project I want to work on right now. So I choose Yes. Notice that a new window appears now. Absolutely, I can easily split the workspace between these two windows for you right now. So that's exactly what I'll do. Notice that the active project is always the one with the small lightning bolt button highlighted in the top left corner. So right at this moment, this specific project is active. And when I go ahead and click on the lightning bolt on this side, by simply using this specific button here, my previous project will become fully active and ready to use once more. Whenever I need to do so, I can also easily switch back over to the other project by simply navigating to the window command and selecting it from the list. But having said that, I need to activate it again using this specific method. And now for the most interesting part. Regardless of which project is currently active, I can copy resources between these projects, in particular, audio files. So, of course, I can copy audio files onto an audio track, for example, like this. The program asks me whether to perform the appropriate conversion. If I decide to do so, I simply check both options. There you go. I can also copy files from different tracks in this way. Unfortunately, at this time, it's not possible to copy entire tracks, but you can save them as so-called track presets, and then all the settings for those tracks will be saved. We can recall them later. I've already explained how to create new projects, how to save them, how to restore a previous version of a saved project, and how to effectively transfer data between projects. Now, it's an opportune moment to thoroughly discuss how to effectively utilize the autosave function, and furthermore, how to meticulously create comprehensive project backups, carefully taking into full account their various and distinct components. At this very moment, I still have two other projects currently open, so I will simply close one of them, choosing deliberately not to save any of the recent changes, and then I will return to my original primary project. The program asks me whether to save the files I imported. I can delete them all and then return to my original project once again, and then I can activate it. Let's start with automatic backup. This feature is enabled by default. You can easily find it in the main edit menu within the Preferences window, specifically located under the General tab. This feature is simply called autosave. By default, the program saves a copy, a backup of our important project file every 15 minutes, and the maximum number of these saved files is 10. Usually that's quite sufficient, but you can easily increase it if you truly want to. These project files are usually not very large, so it's a really very good and practical option. You'll typically find them in the project directory with the BSC extension. If, like me, you often find yourself starting to work on a project without truly knowing what the final outcome will be, or even what you'll ultimately name the project, meaning you frequently use the default naming convention within Until, specifically untitled followed by a number, then a truly very nice and incredibly useful feature to be aware of is the backup project function. This remarkable function allows us to conveniently save a fresh, completely clean copy of the entire project, effectively without any previous versions or any unnecessary files that we might have imported but no longer actively use. This is indeed a really great and exceptionally beneficial feature, and it importantly allows us to perform this action under a chosen name in a specific directory of our own choosing and with whatever particular name we ultimately desire. The backup project function can be found in the File menu. After activating it, the program will ask us where, in which directory, and under what name to save the project. So first we select the directory. We can also create one ourselves. On a PC, you just right-click with your mouse and create a folder. Let's say I name it after one of the files, for example, filtered stuff. And once I select this specific directory or confirm its chosen name, a window like this will then appear. Here, I can also easily enter the project's name, for example, 01, and now I have several options to choose from. Keep current project active. If this option is selected, I will still be able to work on the current project. Otherwise, a copy named filtered stuff will be launched, meaning this new copy of the project. A very important function is minimize audio files. When you select it, only those fragments of audio files that are used in the project will be saved in the project directory, but you have to remember that this limits your ability to edit the recordings later on. At the very same time, the program will automatically and seamlessly save all offline operations directly to the designated target files. So it depends on whether we're already sure that we've finished editing the audio. If not, I would suggest leaving this option unchecked, as well as any of those other offline edits that you might see. However, we can specifically remove files that we're not using. We imported them, we deleted them. A very nice and useful function. Do not back up video.
If there is a video file present in the project, we can then decide whether it should be carefully copied to this specific folder or not. If there are any associated bounces, they can also be copied automatically unless we explicitly specify that we absolutely do not want that to happen. I will now click OK. As you can see, the specific filtered staff 01 project has now been successfully opened. In short, this essentially means that I am now actively working on the project under a brand new name in a completely new folder. Of course, the best way to start working with the program is with your own project, which you can gradually build, or by analyzing some ready-made examples. It just so happens that Steinberg currently provides, I believe, two very nice, well-arranged projects. It's worth taking advantage of this to take a closer look at the various functions of the program and how you can use them. Let's start with the fact that the project window is divided into four main sections. The upper part, or the upper zone, is the arrangement window. Here you can see all the tracks which are currently collapsed into so-called group tracks, folders, where you'll find the individual tracks. The window itself is divided into two parts. We'll talk about how to do that in a moment. Thanks to this, the marker track and tempo track are visible at all times. The lower part is the mixer window, or various types of editors. The left part is the inspector window, showing detailed settings for individual tracks or folders. The right part contains meters, a search tool, and other features. So let's take a closer look at some selected functions. If, while loading the demo project, you see a message about missing files, it most likely means that some of the program's resources are missing, so make sure you have installed all of them using the Steinberg Download Assistant. The top zone, the top window, that is the arrangement window, is always visible, and this is the main view. The other windows, that is the left part, the right part, and the bottom part, the lower zone, can be hidden if needed. There are buttons for this in the top right corner. All you need to do is press them and the respective zones will disappear. Also note that different keyboard shortcuts are assigned to these buttons. They might not be visible at the moment. Maybe I'll try to collapse this view a bit to reveal them. So for example, the lower zone can be hidden and shown using the shortcut Ctrl-Alt-E or Ctrl-Alt-B. The hints that appear here are shown because we have a special feature enabled in the settings. Maybe I'll just show you right away where to find it. It's in the Edit menu, Preferences window, General tab, and here we have the Show Tips feature. It's worth enabling, especially if you're just getting to know the program and learning how to use it. After enabling it, you need to click Apply and confirm your decision by pressing OK. In short, the arrangement window simply contains a record of all project elements over time. This time can be measured in different ways, which we will discuss later. On the left side, you can see the track headers with basic information. To distinguish them, they are marked with different colors, but also with icons that indicate whether we're dealing with an audio track or a virtual instrument. Of course, tracks form a separate category. There are effect tracks for send effects, as well as group tracks, which allow you to process a certain category or group of tracks together. In the bottom right corner, there are sliders that let us scale the arrangement view. See how it looks in context. So if we want to zoom in or out on this view a bit, we can do it using these sliders. Right now, all the tracks are clearly visible at a glance. But let's go back to the view that contains all four windows. Here is the view of the vocal tracks. Notice that selecting a vocal track, for example, lead vocal verse, also highlights it in the mixer window. Additionally, on the left side in the inspector window, detailed information about the settings of that track is displayed, in particular, its inputs, MIDI outputs if it were a MIDI track, as well as audio outputs, and for example, the tools used such as equalizer tools, meaning mixer tools, but also insert effects, sends or MIDI effects in the case of instruments. Additionally, I wanted to draw your attention to the fact that clicking anywhere within the upper or lower window causes the frame around that window to light up. What does that mean? It means that we can use various kinds of keyboard shortcuts in relation to the contents of that window. For example, the G and H keys are used to zoom in or compress the arrangement view, just like with the mixer. When I click somewhere within the mixer, the G and H keys allow me to expand or narrow the view of individual channels. The left and right windows, or the left and right zones, also have their own tabs. For example, in the case of the inspector, we have the visibility tab. So here, we adjust the arrangement view. So we can decide that drum tracks, guitar tracks, effect tracks, or other tracks will not be visible in the arrangement window, which allows us to focus on editing a selected group of tracks. Because sometimes you have a very large recording that contains a huge number of tracks. So this option can be useful at times. Similarly, we have this in the mixer window as well, which I will also talk about when I discuss the mixer. Dividing into an upper and lower zone also has other uses. Namely, here we can display not only the mixer view, but also, for example, the editor view. Editor. So if we click on a clip, it will appear here for editing. Notice that right now you can see the audio editor. For example, if we click on a track, MIDI, the piano roll editor will appear here. So now we can edit, insert notes, and so on. Additionally, this editor can also take the form of a drum editor. It's a really nice editor. I use it for programming drums. In fact, I once used it in a rhythm programming course. It's a very convenient tool for programming drums. And of course, the score editor can also be useful here. In addition, we can also switch this window to sample control mode, which is a very interesting feature because here we can, for example, load an audio clip and play it, triggering those samples in different keys. Chord pad allows us to use predefined chords, for example, in relation to virtual instruments. So if we were to select some kind of instrument, we would hear the chords. I'll talk more about the MIDI remote tab another time. The right zone is also multifunctional. It's the window on the right. Here we can also switch this meter view to a view of all the virtual instruments running in the project, the browser, or the control room, which I'll probably dedicate a separate episode to as well. And here, by the way, I'd like to point out that Cubase is an extremely comprehensive application, and many operations can be performed in several different ways. For example, listen to this vocal fact. I can change the volume on this track using this fader right here, but I can also do it by simply going to the inspector window and adjusting the volume with this fader as well. I can also access and open the track directly and easily from the track header itself. So even if the inspector window is turned off, I can do this by accessing the Edit Channel Settings window. I press the button with the letter E, and this window appears. And as you can see here, I also have a fader available. In addition to that, I can see all the plugin processors running on this channel, the equalizer, and the available send effects. Additionally, if we take a look inside the mixer view in this lower area, we can also get a clear preview of the plugin effects or send effects currently running on each of the individual audio channels, just like we are doing right now. We can also enlarge the mixer view to almost fill the entire screen. But for more comfortable and even more precise work, it's useful to be able to open this mixer in a separate window. And here, I wanted to draw your attention to the fact that some of these windows, some of these areas, are also available as separate windows. Just take a look at the studio menu, and here, for example, you'll find mix control, control room, VST instruments, etc. as separate windows. Some of them also have specific keys assigned to them. Of course, you can also assign your own keyboard shortcuts to them. And here's an interesting fact. We have more than one console here, and that's because each of these windows can be configured in a different way. For example, you can set one up to view the rhythm section, meaning drums together with bass tracks, and another window, for instance, to preview what's on the vocal tracks. So if you have two screens, you can quite easily split your display between the mixer, or you can also divide your screens between the mixer and other areas of the program, such as the arrangement or editing windows. So it's definitely very cool, and it really allows you to customize the program to your own needs and personal preferences. I can imagine that on an ultra wide screen, like a 34, 38, or even 49-inch, you can work with two windows side by side. If a particular window configuration, which is the way we arrange panels and tools within our software, works well for us in our workflow, such as when editing photos or organizing documents, we can save it as what's called a workspace. All you need to do is go to the Workspaces menu and select the Add Workspace option. There's also a keyboard shortcut for this, Control+0 on the numeric keypad. A screen like this will appear, and here we can enter a name, for example, 5050. This workspace can be a global workspace, meaning we'll be able to select it for any newly created project, or it can belong to a specific project. I'm saving it as a global setting. Notice that now in the list of available workspaces, I'll find several settings, including the one I named Musino, and this setting simply contains the standard view of all four zones. But besides that, I also saved this 50/50 view, and now, as you can see, the screen is divided between two zones. These workspaces also have keyboard shortcuts assigned to them right away, Alt 1, 2, 3 on the numeric keypad, so it will be quite easy for us to switch between them. One more important note at the end. I don't know if you've noticed, but some interface elements are equipped with buttons featuring a gear icon. Here, a menu is currently concealed that allows you to hide or reveal particular specific elements of a given menu. And as you can see at the bottom, there is usually also a button or an option to select Show All. This allows you to conveniently display all of the elements that are available within that particular menu at once. If you want to return to the default set of options, just press the button labeled Reset All. Moreover, when you select this setup option from the list, you can also adjust or decide on the order of the individual elements. So take note, I will now change the order or placement of the automation mode section. For example, I'll move it 2 positions further down. I don't know if you noticed, but the layout of the buttons at the top has changed, so it's worth being aware of that. What's more, you can also save a given layout as a preset. So if you're used to a certain layout and someone changes it on you, you can always return to your own preset, especially if, for example, several engineers use the program in the studio. So that's a nice and valuable feature. And of course, if you don't see a particular element on the list, but you see it in my tutorial, it probably means it's hidden in one of these menus. I'll show you how to navigate the arrangement window in Cubase. It's worth learning this before you even start recording or editing audio. This will make your work much more pleasant, smoother, and more efficient. And since there are so many ways to do it, there will be a lot of information. You might even want to prepare something to take notes with. In front of me is one of the factory projects. You can download it from the manufacturer's website. It's also advertised within what's called the hub, Control-N or File New. Here on the left side, you'll find various important information, including the convenient option to download this entire factory project. It's called Pop Demo by Austin Hall. If the Hub tab is not readily visible, please go to the Edit menu, then select Preferences, and in the General tab, simply uncheck the option to use Hub. Apply. Okay. Let's start with horizontal scaling. I'll show you right now. First of all, we can scale the arrangement view using the mouse. To adjust the view, simply click somewhere up here, specifically within the area known as the timeline, using the left mouse button. Then gently move the mouse either upwards or downwards to achieve the desired adjustment. Notice that the arrangement view is being stretched or compressed. It can also be compressed within quite a wide range. At this moment, the arrangement window covers even up to 1,200 bars, which is a lot, really a lot. And now I will fully explain to you precisely why that is. It results from the project settings themselves, so from the File menu, you can select the Project Setup option. Let me remind you of the shortcut Shift-S. A window like this will appear, and here in the Project Duration tab, you can specify the maximum duration of the project. You can always easily change this particular setting, and if you set, for example, a duration of 3 minutes, you'll notice that now it won't be possible to stretch the project to such an extreme length, which also makes working with stretching much more convenient and efficient. And one more thing, when I move the mouse like this, you may have noticed that I can effortlessly move it left and right after a click, which allows me to scale the project and smoothly scroll through the contents. You can also stretch and compress the arrangement view using the G and H keys. So I've placed my mouse cursor here, and now I'll use these buttons. Notice that G effectively compresses the arrangement view, while H, on the other hand, expands it. A very useful and convenient keyboard shortcut is Shift F. Shift F simply stretches the entire arrangement view to completely fill the entire window. So if this particular window was significantly larger, for example, if I now temporarily hid the detailed view of these meters on the right side of the screen, then Shift F would then make the arrangement or the arrangement recording fill the whole available window. So Shift F is also a very useful and important function that you definitely should remember and utilize. We can also scale the arrangement view horizontally using the magnifier available from the toolbar. Let me remind you that these toolbar tools are available, or rather, we switch between them using the number keys 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and under number 6, we have the magnifier. Remember, 6 is the magnifier. And now, when I carefully select a specific section, for example, the entire chorus part, like this precisely with the mouse, the visual arrangement or the detailed view within this particular window will be dynamically stretched and expanded to completely cover this entire pre-chorus segment, ensuring a comprehensive display of the selected area. It's also very easy to restore the previous state, the previous zoom level. You just need to double-click in the arrangement window. There you go. That's how it looked before zooming in. Another quick double-click will show you the complete view of the entire arrangement. So if you select something specific with the mouse, for example, like this time focusing on the chorus, you can conveniently go back by simply double-clicking. And now, if you click with Alt, you effectively restore the previous zoom of the arrangement or zoom back in precisely on the chorus. But here, I wanted to point out one more thing to you. No matter where you click with Alt, even at the beginning of the arrangement, you're always taken to that area to the zoom level you set earlier, which in this case is from bar 27. Regardless of where you precisely click with Alt, a double click invariably restores the previous most recent view. You can also effectively scale the arrangement view horizontally using this convenient slider located right here. Furthermore, you can also readily utilize the familiar plus and minus buttons, and under this small arrow, you will readily find the very familiar Zoom Full function, as well as the equally useful Zoom for Locators function. How does it work? Notice that right now the locators currently cover the entire musical arrangement, but we can easily drag them, for example, to just the pre-chorus section. So I'll show you now. I'm selecting just the pre-chorus part, which is only these 4 bars. And now, when I carefully select Zoom to Locators from this comprehensive list, the program will then zoom in accordingly and precisely. You can also easily save specific zoom levels as convenient presets. Just simply press the Add button and save it under a chosen descriptive name, then recall it effortlessly from the list. The Organize window thoughtfully allows us to manage these valuable presets, delete them as needed, and so on with complete ease. To sum up, the fundamental and basic ways to scale the overall arrangement horizontally include simply clicking the timeline with the left mouse button and then dragging it either up or down in order to adjust the view. You can also move this arrangement view left and right after clicking. The shortcuts Shift-S as well as G and H for zooming in and out are also very useful. Also, remember about the convenient magnifier available in the toolbar located under the number 6 key. Oh, and when using the magnifier, remember that double-clicking and double-clicking with Alt lets you seamlessly switch between the various selected views. We already know how to stretch the arrangement view horizontally. Now it's time to show how to stretch and compress the view of individual tracks, which is especially important when working on large projects. The factory project being presented here is quite complex, and what you see here are not so much tracks as catalogs containing tracks of a given type, for example, drum tracks, send tracks, effect tracks, vocal tracks, synthesizer tracks, and so on. By clicking on the icon with the envelope symbol, the catalog, in the track header area, you can expand them individually, and by clicking with the Ctrl key, you can expand them all at once. In that case, the ability to hide the lower section comes in handy. For this, the shortcut Ctrl-Alt-E is used. You can also use this icon hidden here in the top right corner, this one right here. I think I already showed this earlier as well. Tracks can also be conveniently collapsed and expanded using the dedicated track folding command, which is found within the project menu. These specific commands are clearly called fold tracks for the purpose of collapsing and project track folding and fold tracks for effectively expanding them. You can also change this state. For example, if you want to reveal the view of collapsed tracks and collapse those that are expanded, meaning the folders, you can use the command project track folding flip fold states. In that case, what was expanded becomes collapsed and vice versa. So it's a very useful function as well. All right, but what about scaling the track headers themselves and the height of those tracks? As you probably remember, the magnifier shown here only allows us to scale horizontally. But it doesn't have to be that way. We can specify this quite precisely within the Preferences window. To do this, I will go to the main Edit menu, then carefully select Preferences, and in the subsequent Preferences window, I specifically need to locate and find the editing option. Under the Tools section, I will then uncheck the Zoom option, ensuring it is deselected. This is the standard horizontal mode by default. So I will uncheck this particular function, confirm my choice by simply clicking Apply, then OK, and now the magnifier will also allow me to scale vertically. If I carefully select only this specific area, that particular area will be greatly enlarged. I double-click to quickly return. If I want to take a much closer look at these individual vocal tracks, I will select them and then double-click, then return, and I do precisely the same for all the other tracks. I go back, carefully select the tracks, zoom in, double-click, and then return. So it's a really cool and incredibly useful feature. Individual tracks, once selected, can also be stretched manually like this. You can also select multiple tracks to stretch by holding down the Shift key. With Shift and the arrow keys, for example, I select all the bass tracks and the bass stab, and now I can stretch them all at once. Altogether, however, if I press and hold the Ctrl key while stretching, I can effectively stretch all of the tracks at precisely the same time. Please take a look. So it's a very powerful feature. I can also collapse the view of all tracks. So wherever I click, I can stretch the track, and there you go. See for yourself. I stretch and collapse. So we can also scale the arrangement view vertically using this particular slider, which is conveniently located in the bottom right corner of the arrangement window. This way, please take careful note, or alternatively, by utilizing these tiny plus and minus buttons. Thanks to this, we can now do it much more precisely and accurately. But I also wanted to draw your attention to what's hidden under this little arrow. I click it. Notice that now I can set the height of the tracks in rows. So if I choose Zoom Tracks 1 row, all tracks will have the height of a so-called standard single row. If, for example, I select Zoom Tracks 4 rows here, then they will have the height of 4 rows. I can even specify exactly how many tracks should fit vertically in the arrangement window. So it can be 4 tracks, in which case 4 tracks will be visible, or it can be 8 tracks like this. Or it can be, for example, 16 tracks if I enter that number in this box. 16 individual tracks, and there you go. Now exactly 16 distinct tracks are clearly visible in my current window. But of course, this is also a fundamental function of the window itself, because if I were to display the mixer window here, then after carefully selecting this particular function, there will now be the same number, only they will obviously be narrower. Just like with horizontal scaling using the G and H buttons, you can also scale the arrangement vertically using the shortcuts Shift, G, and H. But that's not all. I want to show you a few really important and super useful features that make working with large projects like this one much easier, where, for example, there are dozens of tracks. As you can clearly see, this particular project is so incredibly large and extensive that after carefully clicking with the Ctrl key on the designated folder track header, once you then fully expand those numerous folders, you can no longer easily see the individual track names after completely minimizing their vertical view. But there's a way to fix this. Just go to the Preferences window. You should edit Preferences, and in the tab called the Event Display, specify for which height the relevant data ought to be displayed. If you select Minimal here, then even after clicking Apply, some information will still be displayed even for such minimized tracks. At the very least, you can clearly see precisely where there is some musical notation or where audible sound is present. Yeah, so it's worth changing this function here. For working with large projects, I press Apply and OK. If you don't want to use the loop, meaning 6, and the magnifying glass to zoom in, Shift S, or zooming individual tracks, again, I double click, then you can also use another command, which you activate with the shortcut Alt S. So look, I select these effect tracks in the middle of the arrangement just like before, and I press Alt S. Now this view has been zoomed in exactly to that view. I cannot easily exit this particular Zoom meeting right now, but I can certainly press the Ctrl-A key combination to select absolutely everything, and then subsequently press Alt-S once again. At this precise point in time, the visual display will appear somewhat compressed, and pressing Alt-S for a second time simply restores the minimum possible height. So for example, if I wanted to reveal the vocal tracks here, which you probably can't clearly see right now, I would simply select them at the bottom, and then I would press Alt-S, and the view will be enlarged. Ctrl-A and Alt-S, and Alt-S again, and I reduce it. The same, for example, for some MIDI recording. For example, I select this section, Alt-S, and again, Ctrl-A, Alt-S, Alt-S, Alt-S. And one more very important function. If we don't want to do it manually every time, to enlarge the track view for the track we want to edit. So for example, if we want to edit some vocals now, we select that track and we need to expand its view to see what's going on and make precise edits. We can program the software to do this automatically. To accomplish this, navigate to the Edit menu, then locate the Preferences window. Within that window, find the Editing, Project and Mix Console tab, and here, carefully check the Enlarge option. For the selected track, all that's left is to click Apply and OK. Notice that now the view of each selected track will be enlarged. How much it's enlarged depends on us. If I enlarge this view more, then every time I select a track, the program remembers this setting and enlarges the view of each selected track. Right now, I'm scrolling using the arrow keys on the keyboard. You can easily find the Enlarge Selected Track function in the Edit menu right here, and in the Zoom tab you will find all of the important keyboard shortcuts, so it is a very good idea to remember them. I've created an empty project and I want to show you how to create tracks. So the first method involves using the command project add track. And in this menu, you get a full list of all available types of tracks, including, for example, marker tracks, folder tracks, chord tracks, and so on. These require separate episodes to discuss, but here we have the 4 basic tracks: audio, instrument, MIDI, and sampler. However, it's definitely easier to create these tracks simply by right-clicking somewhere here in the window on the headers. So the first type of track is, of course, the audio track, for example, to make a microphone recording. And so the program asks us which input we want to record from. Here, a complete list of all available inputs also appears. First and foremost, of course, the program shows us a list of monophonic inputs first, followed by stereo pairs. It just so happens that my microphone is connected to the second monophonic input, so I'll select that one. I can configure the track as monophonic, for example, to use it with some monophonic versions of certain plugins to save CPU power. However, I personally prefer to always have flexibility and work with stereo plugins, so I don't select either the left or right channel as the output. Instead, I immediately choose the stereo output. I can give it a name or simply leave this track unnamed for now. It has appeared as audio 1, and then I indicate how many of these tracks I want to create. Let's say I'll just create one track. Here it is. Now, after enabling monitoring here, you'll see that the sound from my microphone should appear here on this input. If it doesn't show up, you need to check the settings in the inspector window. So if we haven't selected this input, the sound won't appear. I selected it, and now the sound is coming through to the track. It's coming through. The second type of track you can hook in here. Maybe I'll delete this track first. You do that by right-clicking and selecting the command Remove Selected Tracks, Shift-Delete. Previously, you could just press delete in older versions of Cubase, but it was quite easy to delete these tracks, so they introduced this safeguard. Shift-Delete deletes the track. The second type of track is an instrument track, and here we can immediately choose the virtual instrument we want to launch. We can also type its name here if we want to launch Retrolog, which is Cubase's built-in synthesizer. We type in Retrolog, click, and the program already allows us to create, let's call it the instrument name here, the virtual instrument. And let's suppose I want to create one such track with this specific instrument. There you go, it's been created. At the same time, the program launched the instrument for me. And now I could choose a preset from the list and just play. Again, Shift-Delete, I remove this track. The next type of basic track is a MIDI track. A MIDI track can have its own name, but it doesn't have to. It'll be labeled as MIDI 01. Notice that now, in the inspector window on the left, I can select a specific output port. Let's suppose I would like to simply have this sound go to the output of my interface. So here I select a babyface MIDI port, which is the MIDI output of my interface on a specific channel. This could be, for example, channel 1 or channel 10. If I have a drum machine connected, then in this case, it'll be channel 10. So this is the third type of track. At the same time, if you have any virtual instrument running, it will also appear here on the list, and then you can route the sound from this track directly to a specific virtual instrument or simply leave it essentially unconnected. So that's also possible. You can also select the MIDI channel and specify the output one here as well. Shift-Delete, I'm deleting the track. The last type of track is the one called sample track. It's something like a hybrid. In that case, in the lower window, if it's not visible, let me remind you, here you can open this lower window, this lower zone. You need to select Sampler Control and import a sample here. Any imported sample can then be played chromatically using the keyboard, so this is also a very interesting feature, and I think I'll dedicate a separate episode to the sampler track. Before we move on, I wanted to make a certain distinction to explain to you the difference between MIDI tracks and instrument tracks, that is, tracks for virtual instruments. It's quite simple. MIDI tracks simply have a MIDI input and a MIDI output. Instrument tracks have a MIDI input and an audio output that is already integrated with the virtual instrument. Let me show you exactly what I mean by this. So I am now creating a new MIDI track. And as you can see, it has now appeared in the mixer as a separate track. I don't have to assign anything to it. It will simply be visible as a MIDI track. Now, as I press the keys on this keyboard, a distinct signal appears right here. This is a MIDI signal, so I can now route this signal to a specific instrument or to a specific audio output destination. And of course, recording on this track after pressing record means recording MIDI messages. I'm hitting the keyboard now, which you probably can't see. In the specific case of virtual instruments, or more precisely, an instrument track, the MIDI track that we are meticulously creating here, a dedicated audio channel is immediately and automatically assigned within the mixer. Consequently, we do not have a separate MIDI output that needs to be managed independently here. We simply have a track where we record MIDI, and it's permanently assigned to this virtual instrument, which has its own channel in the mixer. Of course, I can now effectively route these incoming MIDI messages directly to this particular instrument, but I am required to perform this specific operation right here within the dedicated mixer interface. So take a closer look. Now with this setup, I will be fully able to play and control messages on both of these tracks using this single instrument. So we have a dedicated MIDI track whose output we can readily assign to a selected virtual instrument if we so desire, and we also have an instrument track which is permanently assigned to a specific instrument, unless we load a completely different one, of course. In addition to this, the virtual instrument is also clearly visible in the VST Instruments tab. This is located in the right-hand side zone, or alternatively, in the dedicated VST Instruments window, which you can easily bring up by using the F11 key. So, right now, you can clearly see that our RetroLog virtual instrument is indeed here. From this particular window, we can conveniently add new tracks with additional virtual instruments or simply add the virtual instruments themselves, allowing for greater creative flexibility. This might be confusing at first, but I think we'll clear it up quickly in a moment when I show you instruments like Halion Sonic, where many different sounds are actually run and handled on different MIDI channels, or drum machines, which also handle MIDI messages and have multiple audio outputs. So it's a very useful feature. In short, this essentially means that I can now confidently delete both the MIDI track and the associated instrument track itself. So first I will proceed to delete the MIDI track, then I will delete the corresponding track for this particular instrument. It has also been removed from the VSTI list, so it's no longer in the VST Instruments rack. And now from this rack, I can load just the instrument itself. So instead of going here to add instrument track, I go here to add rack instrument. And now I can select, for example, a multi-channel instrument here, Contact, Groove Agent 1, whatever it may be. Notice that the instrument is being loaded. The program will, of course, ask if you want to create a MIDI track assigned to it, but you can click Cancel to skip this option, and then you'll see that only the instrument itself has been launched in Cubase. At this point, there is no track assigned to it yet. You can create such a track yourself in the Add MIDI track screens and assign this track to control the instrument, for example, by selecting here Groove Agent 1 Main or Groove Agent 1 Pattern. So you can, for instance, trigger patterns via MIDI. Let me remind you, I'll select Main, and now using the keyboard, of course, as long as I choose an instrument here, I will be able to trigger various different types of samples. What's more, I will now be able to assign separate individual outputs to these samples. Take a look. I'll show you exactly how to do it right away. I'll route this kick drum to the second channel. I'll carefully route this kick drum to the third channel, the crisp snare to the fourth channel, the clap perhaps to the fifth channel, and the second snare to the sixth channel. Now, take a good look at how this will visually appear in the mixer, so I'll proceed to open the mixer window. Let's thoroughly check it out. So now, each individual sound appears on a different audio channel, while I'm controlling this instrument from just one single track. MIDI. Sometimes it happens that within a single virtual instrument, multiple sounds are running, and then you can create multiple channels by sending the MIDI signal to the same instrument, Groove Agent 1 in this case, but to a different MIDI channel. You can see this clearly now in the inspector settings.
In one of my previous videos, I showed methods for creating the 4 basic types of tracks: audio tracks, virtual instrument tracks, MIDI tracks, and sample track tracks, which, by the way, I will definitely dedicate a separate video to in the future. But you can also search for program resources and, in general, instruments, settings, and effect chains by choosing the Using Track preset option. This way, for example, you can also save instruments along with effects, etc., which you can recall in future sessions. A very useful feature. When you select it, this window appears. On the left side, we have filters, which you can reset by pressing this tiny button. On the right side, there's a list of results, just like you see here. At the moment, this list includes about 4,300 results for different types of settings, and among these settings, you'll find, among others, settings for audio tracks, meaning track preset audio. Here, you'll generally find audio tracks with settings for different instruments. Basically, you could call them multi-effects. So after selecting this option, an audio track will be inserted and loaded with the settings that the manufacturer recommends for this type of instrument. In this case, the Wurlitzer piano. So take a look. These are the effects we have in the chain here. We've got reverb, mod machine, a modulation effect, and a phaser. Saving your own settings of this type is a piece of cake. Let's say I wanted to add another type of effect here. I'll go ahead and manually type in the word delay, and then I'll proceed to add in the built-in stereo delay to the set. And now I'll just perform a right-click on the header of this track to save this entire configuration as a new preset. So I'll go ahead and select Save Track Preset. A window like this will pop up, and I can enter a name here. For example, I'll go ahead and type in the name Wurlitzer delay here.
And I can also add various types of attributes here. So I click on this button in the upper right corner of this window. And I can, for example, go ahead and specifically define the type of instrument, its unique character, and a variety of other specific details. So among the different categories available, I am going to select, for example, the piano. And for the character, I'll configure the settings to be polyphonic, maybe also vintage, and so on and so forth. Resonant. If I'm happy with this selection, I click OK. I can also enter my own rating, indicate the style, let's say it's mostly going to be piano. For example, it is frequently used in modern electronic dance music, or in rhythmic beat music, or even in vintage chiptune styles. And the subcategory will, of course, be electric piano, if I can find it, so E-piano. And now I can finally save my preset called Wurlitzer Delay to preset, so I click OK. And this preset should now appear in the browser. So let's check it. I right-click again, select the Using Track Preset option, or maybe I'll do it differently. I'll click in an empty area on Using Track Preset, and now look, I'm searching for my preset. I type in Wurlitzer, and look, my preset has been found. And indeed, when I select it, the track with those 4 effects will be loaded. The second specific type of settings I can choose by utilizing the Using Track Preset command are the particular settings for the instrument itself. So again, from this Attributes window, I select Logical, reset the settings, the browser, look, now I select the instrument preset, and now let's go ahead and find it right here. There are only a small handful of about a dozen instruments on the results list. That is simply how it happened to turn out this time. And notice, when I clicked just now within the selected instrument, it has been automatically loaded in the background. So now I can start playing using it on the MIDI keyboard. I can also categorize these instruments by their characteristics. Let's say I choose bass. Here we have 4 presets. I'm currently playing on the keyboard now, but I can also record and save a musical phrase in the memory recorder. Look, I press the play button and start playing. And I press play again. Now, every instrument I select will play that phrase. Of course, as long as the play button's pressed. We can also upload any custom MIDI file that we would like to use for a specific project right here. That's also quite an interesting solution. So if we like a particular instrument, we can just load it up. What's also pretty interesting is that if I choose, for example, this guitar here, I can also add effects to it and save it. This is done as an instrument preset. So I navigate over to the settings, then to audio inserts in the inspector window right here. And I select from the list, for example, a reverb effect plugin. I'll use the built-in Roomworks. Here you go, here it is. And now, by right-clicking anywhere on this track, I can save it as a track preset. Again, this window pops up. I'll type in now, guitar. Reverberated. That's the name. Of course, I could also enter, just like last time, all those additional parameters. Additional ones which will make it easier for me to find it in the future. Remember, they're available after pressing this button. But if I don't want to do that, I can just save this preset here. And now, if I delete this track, I can call it my preset again. By utilizing the track preset browser, the option you're looking for should be readily available. So I can just type the name into the search bar and it immediately comes up for me to select. This is the preset. You'll notice that when I click Add Track, a brand new track is going to be added, along with the reverb that I have applied. I am now going to delete it. Cubase is also generously equipped with MIDI effects, so by using the Track Preset browser, you can select a MIDI track here. I reset the filters, just like before, and select a MIDI track preset. And for example, in the list of factory settings, you'll find something called Chord Memorizer. The Chord Memorizer, and here on this MIDI track, I have one MIDI effect running, which is simply called quarter. It's a really cool effect. I might even dedicate a separate episode to it. It can contain different types of chords triggered by single keys. Take a look at how it works. I press learn, then pick a key for which I want to save a set of chords. Maybe I'll just reset its settings first. I select learn, press a button, and save a chord. And for the next one, I save a different chord for another note. And look, now by pressing any of these keys, I can trigger the chords I've saved like this. I can also save this as a preset and the whole thing as a MIDI preset, so it's worth using this feature. It really makes things easier and sometimes speeds up your workflow. Okay, I'm deleting this track. Shift-L. An interesting feature is the ability to recall and save a set of very different tracks. Look, I'm selecting again, using track preset, and this time in the attribute browser. Again, I reset the settings and select track preset multi. And for example, on the list, there are settings for multi-track recording, like for a choir. I choose this option, add track. The program creates several tracks with different effects and different EQ settings. For recording the main choir voice and two supporting voices, which will be spread out in the stereo panorama. A really cool option, and if I added more tracks to this, for example, whether it's a complex synthesizer track, or maybe a melodic instrument track, or even just a simple rhythmic bass track, I can easily select all of these different tracks together using the Shift key and then save them as a single track preset for later use. Right-click, and the last option is Save Track Preset. And I can save it as what's called an ensemble. 5 tracks, maybe even with Polish characters. I'm not adding attributes, but of course you can do that here as well. You can also save them in folders to keep things organized. That's pretty much it, but I think saving it to a folder will be enough. So Shift-Delete to remove, and I go back to the track preset window. Now take a look. What do we have here? We have the ensemble, 5 tracks. When I select this option, my 5 tracks will be loaded. In practice, you'll want to use the Using Track Preset option, especially when you're looking for a specific type of sound or drum kit. You do this simply by choosing from the filters. When searching by attributes, select the VST preset option. Of course, it's a good idea to reset your search and results before selecting VST preset. Then you'll see the full list of results. Right now, I have 3,800 results here, and I haven't even installed the entire library. Now, searching by category will be really useful for me, depending on the character of the instrument or the musical style I want to use it in. Alternatively, if you're looking for, say, a drum kit, you'll most likely find it quickest in Groove. Agent 1, Groove, Agent SE. So I just load up a kit like that in the background simply by selecting it with the mouse. And now I can already play using this kit. It's the same with percussion instruments. If I'm looking for, say, organs, I can look for them, for example, in Halion. Or Halion, for example. Sonic SE. Here too, there are 500, 1,000 results, so a whole lot. I'll select, for example, Halion, Sonic. I indicate organs, choose their character as electric, and look, I already have several results right away. Maybe I'll expand it to a larger number of instruments. And load it. Instrument selected. Of course, to such a loaded instrument, we can add a set of effects from the presets. For this purpose, it's best to move to the inspector window. Notice there's an audio insert tab here, and right in the header, there's a tiny icon. That's preset management. And here we have 2 options, load FX chain preset. So we can load a ready-made set of effects. And here we can also search, for example, depending on the sound, I don't know if there are any organ effects. Probably not, but for example, we can load a set of effects for vocals. As you can see, that might work too. The second option is the ability to load effects from a preset. So just like when we created, for example,
the Wurlitzer delay preset, which is an audio track. With these effects, we can load those effects. We can use them in relation to the loaded instrument. So I click, and as remember, I currently have all of these different effects loaded up right here. We can also load effects directly from the mixer window. We'll talk more about that when I discuss the mixer. Here, there's an icon that shows the effects loaded on each channel. So we have the same type of icon here, Load FX Chain preset or Front Track preset. Alternatively, we can also do this from the channel settings window. Here too, we have options in the inserts, Load FX Channel preset and Front Track preset. Like every window in Cubase, this one, Choose Track preset, is also resizable, so we can freely adjust its size and split the area between filters and results. For example, if the filter section's hidden, you'll find an icon for it in the top right corner. We can also add a location view here, but be careful, because if you remove, for example, the user content location, only what we've created ourselves will be displayed here in the results list. Only what we've made ourselves, what we've saved ourselves. So we can search for files, audio, effects, MIDI loops, but only the ones we've saved ourselves. Here, on the other hand, we have everything that's saved in the factory library. That's why it's a good idea to make sure that all media is selected, so you have the full list of results. Most often, or rather most easily, I think, it will be to search for many things by text. For example, if we're looking for a bass, even without specifying whether we're searching for an instrument or a VST track preset, we just search for bass, and most of the time we'll immediately find some kind of instrument here. We can also perform a logical search, for example, by indicating that we're looking for specific presets that happen to contain the word bass. Notice here, for example, we have various presets like 80s chorus, but let's say we don't actually want a bass with chorus, so we can simply select the omit option and then manually type in the word chorus. Now, no preset containing the word chorus will appear on the list. Of course, this is more useful for more advanced searches in the main browser, which is the Media Bay, the browser. It's available here under the F5 key, but we'll talk about that another time. For now, let's get back to our window. Using Track preset, it is also very crucial to keep in mind that these specific buttons on the interface are used to reset or set your search filters, while the buttons with the gear symbol allow you to include various additional categories here as well. So, for example, if we wanted to search or filter this list of results, for instance, by plugin, let's say we're looking for a bass, but we want the list to be organized. According to, for example, instruments, then this is an easy way to do it. We can have here, there is probably a limited and finite number of these additional elements, but there can really be a significant and substantial amount of them. And in that case, the ability to scale this window becomes extremely beneficial and practical. In this episode, I want to prepare you well for registering in the Cubase program. So where do we start? Of course, we'll start by creating a new project. Just a reminder, press Ctrl-N to create a new project or Shift New Project. I'm choosing Create Empty, which means an empty project. And now, the very first step that I will take is to carefully make sure in the project settings, specifically under Project Setup, that the sample rate is set to the correct level, meaning it matches exactly what I expect. For example, 44.1, and I generally recommend recording files at least in 24-bit depth, okay? Before I start recording, I'll make sure that all the physical inputs and outputs of my interface are visible in the program. To do this, I simply go to the Studio menu and select the Studio Setup option. In this window, you'll now notice that I've already selected the audio interface by choosing its drivers, and in its settings, I can find a list of all available input and output ports. So ein means inputs and out, marked here with this circle, are outputs. By default, all of them are marked as visible, and that's how it should be. Some are marked as inactive. Why? This mystery will be explained in a moment. So as you can see right now, the 4 input ports are simply the first and second microphone or combo inputs, actually, because they work as universal line microphone inputs, and 3, 4, or 3 and 4 are the line inputs here.
1 and 2 are the main stereo outputs, and 3 and 4 will be my headphone output. The remaining ports are implemented on ADAT connectors. In the next step, I create an empty audio track, almost all with the mouse, add audio track. A window like this appears, and here I can select a specific physical input of my interface from which I intend to record, or a pair of stereo inputs. First of all, the mono inputs appear, of course. If I were to select, for example, the input to which my microphone is currently connected, so that's exactly the first input, you'll also notice that this track, which represents the audio signal coming from my microphone, has now appeared here in the mixer window, making it visible and accessible for monitoring and adjustment within this section of the software interface. And that sound is coming into this track. What's more, you can also notice, if you look closely in the Studio Setup window right here on your screen, that this port is currently marked as active, which means it is ready for use. This first input is active, and furthermore, when I press the F4 key, the Audio Connections window appears and shows us the input bus, which is labeled as mono in 1. Assigning it as the input for the audio track makes it appear here as the input channel, so I can, for example, name it microphone to help keep things organized. There you go. And now, every time I try to create a new track, this bus will appear here on this list. So it's simply available here as this bus microphone. To create an audio track specifically for my instrument, I click Add Audio Track once again, and this time, from the list, I carefully select the physical pair that corresponds to the third and fourth inputs of my interface. Pay close attention to what happens now. Of course, this particular input will be visible in the inspector window as stereo in 2, but it will also appear in the audio connections window as well. So if I go over here, you'll notice that this input will now be indicated and highlighted right here. I can also give it a name, and that's exactly what I'll do. Mini-Freak. Now the sound will appear on channels 3 and 4. Pay attention to the mixer window. At this point, it's worth taking a moment to say a few words about monitoring, because you can actually configure virtually any interface or any system so that monitoring is handled directly and automatically by the interface itself. And that's exactly how it is right now. The sound that goes to this bus, meaning the bus. The third and fourth outputs of my interface are simultaneously sent to ADAT 7.8, which I use to record sound, and to 1.2, which are my speakers. So when I press keys on the keyboard, the sound goes directly to the interface output, specifically. And this happens because that's how my interface is set up. If I turn down this sound on the interface itself, it will still go to the channel in the program, regardless of the interface volume setting. At the same time, I'll mute it here. But we won't be able to hear it anymore at this particular moment. Therefore, right now, we can try to monitor this sound through the computer system. How do we do that? Notice that now, when I press a key on the keyboard, the sound will appear on tracks 3 and 4, as well as at the program's input, but nothing will be heard through the speakers because monitoring is turned off in the settings of the sound card itself, the interface itself, and it is not enabled in the program. To do this, you need to press the button with the speaker icon on the track, which is always located here. And now we hear the sound that goes into the program and is processed by the program on this output track, but we will hear it with a delay. This delay will be equal to the sum of the input and output latency. In English, this is called round-trip latency, which is the sum of input and output, in this case about 24 milliseconds. For example, if you intend to process, say, sound from a synthesizer in real time, or for example, if you want to sing using delay or reverb, then you should rather look for the lowest possible buffer settings that your interface can handle smoothly and reliably. Perhaps then you'll achieve a total latency of, for example, 3 milliseconds, and in that case, it will work really well. There's another use for this, namely if I place some kind of audio effect not on the audio channel itself, but rather specifically on the input track on the Mini-Freak bus itself. Let's say, for example, it's a beat crusher. Then, if I decide to open this track, first of all, I'll hear the sound with the effect applied. just as it was intended, allowing me to immediately experience the processed audio, which can be quite useful in certain creative situations. But what's more, that affected sound will also be recorded, so if I arm the track, enable monitoring, and start recording, that sound will be recorded with the effect applied. But there's yet another option. That little signal is still coming into the audio interface input, monitoring is turned off on the track. But I can also set it so that this monitoring button automatically enables direct monitoring, meaning monitoring without effects. How would that work? Look, I'm enabling direct monitoring here in the Studio window Studio Setup, and now pressing the monitoring button on the track. This will again make it so that I only hear the completely unprocessed original sound, even though there is a bit crusher effect placed on the input track. And here's one more note. Watch very carefully how this works, because it's actually really clever and interesting when I press this button. Monitoring gets enabled. However, it's currently enabled only on the track for the main output. It's actually not enabled for my personal recording, so that's why you didn't hear it a moment ago. However, it works surprisingly well. So it's worth remembering that if direct monitoring is enabled in the settings, you won't record sound with effects if that's what you wanted. To sum up, if you don't intend to process sound from the inputs through effects in the program, you can enable direct monitoring and check if it works with your interface. However, if you disable this option, you only need to avoid one thing, which is to avoid simultaneous monitoring through the audio interface in the program, because these two functions can overlap. So either you listen through the interface, thank you, or you listen through the program. If you intend to use monitoring through the program, that is, processing the incoming sound in the program with some kind of effects, for example, remember that some plugins, especially things like maximizers, resonance suppressors, and other dynamic processors, can introduce additional latency. In the past, you could check this additional latency, that is the value, in the plugin information window. Now this process is done a bit differently. In the Mix Console interface window, which you can easily bring up by pressing the F3 key on your keyboard, you'll find a button that is labeled as Setup Window Layout. And here, in the top right corner, we need to reveal Channel Latency. Look, now this little window appears in the mixer, and if we have any plugins in a given channel that, if something is the source of additional latency, it will be shown here. As you can see right now, there's quite a lot of latency, 167, almost 168 milliseconds. And of course, this latency can be different on different tracks. Generally, during playback, this latency is compensated for on those tracks, so there's no problem with it. But when we are recording or monitoring sound through effects, it can significantly limit what we can do. Hi, welcome to the evening episode. This is very important because I want to show you, using a few simple phrases that I'll record from this instrument, all the functions related to recording. So stay alert, because if you master this, you're all set. Then you can record and basically create complete arrangements. Arturia Mini Freak, a very unique synthesizer. I recommend checking out the review on my website. I found this drum kit here. So I'm creating a new project, File, New Project, create empty now, and then I create a new audio track. You know how it's done. Right-click, Add Audio Track. My Mini Freak is already set up, connected to the third input and the fourth input of my interface, so all I need to do is select Mini Freak. It's also a good idea to set a name. For example, let it be the name of the preset. I'll explain more about why that is later in this tutorial. I create a track, and by default, the track is already armed for recording. If that's not the case, you need to press this red button. This is due to the settings in the Preferences window. And now I could start recording from the point where I set the virtual playhead. Basically from any point you want, all you need to do is press the stop button, then the record button. You'll find the record button right down at the bottom of the screen on the transport bar, right here, or on the transport bar, that you can simply bring up with the F2 function key right here. However, most often I just press the asterisk as the program suggests. On the numeric keypad, that's the fastest way. So if I want to start recording now, I just need to press the asterisk. And the program is already recording, waiting for a signal to appear. So to generate a signal, I just press one of the buttons. But as you can clearly see, the tempo of this particular project is currently set to 120 beats per minute, while my loop, which is this sequence here, is actually played at a tempo of about 160 to 170 beats per minute. So such a recording really isn't very useful in this case because the beats simply won't line up, they just won't actually match the rhythmic grid, so we'd have to carefully synchronize them, stretch, shift, and warp them, as they say. So, a good way to handle this is to carefully synchronize the instrument with the sequencer, making sure everything is in time. The easiest way to do this is, maybe I'll just delete this file. You can simply select it and press the delay key. You can do this in the transport section, right here. Transport project. Synchronization setup. Now, a window like this will appear, and in this window, under the Destinations tab, you just need to select the MIDI port. This can simply be a connection from the interface, for example, the MIDI output of the interface to the MIDI input of the instrument, or in this particular case, it can just be a USB connection like here. We simply select the port where the MIDI clock, which is this synchronizing signal, should be sent, and then we click OK to confirm our selection. Now, when I press play in the program, the instrument should play this sequence in sync. Everything is correct except that it's playing much slower, so I'll immediately increase the tempo to around 160 beats per minute. Let's check it now. So now, all you need to do is set the playhead exactly wherever you want it to be at this point in your project. For example, let's set it to bar 9 and simply press record. I'll try to make some significant changes every 9 bars or so. Let's listen. Great, so now I have a really nice sequence that I can later on slice up and use, for example, to build the arrangement, essentially when needed. Let's suppose that now I'd like to record a sequence, for example, something like this. For a specific area located in the middle of this drum track. To do this, I can mark this section using so-called locators, or what you might call markers. You simply set them using a stylus in the top window, that is, on the bar. You could say on the timeline. You can do it, for example, like this. This area can be moved. Clicking here will loop it, but more on that later. Basically, I want to use this area for recording. Before I go any further, I'll create another track. I'll name it the same as the preset, which is Crusty Blood. Done. Now, using the 1 and 2 keys on the numeric keypad, I could move between the first and second locator here, and when we set the cursor at the spot where the first locator is, I could simply press the record key, but then the recording will always start a moment later, because I have to press the key first, and only then can I start recording. So what I need is a better time, and you can get that better time in various ways. The first way is to use the pre-roll function. The pre-roll and post-roll function buttons can be found on the transport bar. In my case, they're right here. If they're not visible, you need to click on this button with the gear symbol and bring up the pre- and post-roll options view, or alternatively, display all elements. The transport bar might come in handy, but since there's not much space on the screen of the computer I'm currently recording on, I'll only leave the ones I need for now enabled. Each of these modules, if you see 3 dots appear, can be expanded further. You can now see that the pre-roll function, which we activate like this, gives us 2 bars of breathing space before the recording starts. Let's check then how this might work. I'm setting the playhead. At the start of this selection, that is at the point where the so-called left locator is. And here's one more note. You can also change the position of the locators directly from this transport bar. Okay. And now I press record. I'll just delete this audio file as I won't need it anymore. And I just record carefully until the sound fades out. Right. Alternatively, you can also use the metronome to start recording from a specific point. You'll also find the metronome on the transport bar down here at the bottom. You can activate it using the C key on your keyboard. It has the same symbol on the transport bar. It's worth checking its settings, so let's see what we've got here. Firstly, we can decide whether the metronome should count in and how long that count in should be. At the moment, I set it to 2 bars. You can also set it so that when the metronome is on, it will click either during recording or during both recording and playback. Recording, playing, so there are quite a few options in this menu. If you select click during counting, you don't even need to activate the metronome. But suppose I wanted it to actually be audible during recording. Say, I turn on the metronome, then create a new track and carefully name it this time. Geiger. There you go. And now I press record. We should hear the sound of the metronome. It's ready. Oh, one more note. This menu here can also be expanded, and in fact, counting has a separate button, so we can also start the counting using this button without turning on the metronome. But let's suppose we want the metronome to keep running for us. For this particular track, during the playback process, I take here click while playing, all three available options, and then I go to the click sound settings. Take a look at them. The default sound is the one you already know. But it can also be other sounds. In theory, you can even configure a synthesizer to literally trigger certain sounds for you. Here we have MIDI messages which allow us to control such an external synthesizer. So there really are a lot of possibilities, including the fact that we can program various types of patterns, for example, for rhythms other than 4/4. Alright, but what if we want the recording to start exactly where we set the left locator and end where we set the right one? For this, we need to use the punch-in, punch-out function. You can, of course, find the punch-in and punch-out function on the transport bar. Right here, these are the icons. You can also activate it from the transport menu under punch points. And look, punch-in is represented by the letter I. Punch-out is the letter O. So there are also dedicated keys set by default to operate this function. If this function isn't visible on the transport bar, let me remind you, of course, you need to bring it up from this menu, punch points. Now, all you need to do is simply enable the punch-in point and the punch-out point, and by default, thanks to the lock punch points to locators function being enabled, recording will be subject to the constraints of the left and right locator. So we don't even need to start playback. Sorry, I mean recording, just playback alone is enough. So I'll create a new track, name it Harming Bass, and simply start recording. Take a look. And notice the program recorded only that specific section. Now I can move this area and carefully record another phrase in a different spot, just as before. So I listen to the previous phrase. And even if I keep playing, the program won't record it. So I'll record another phrase. Great, so now I have 3 phrases to choose from. But I also wanted to take a moment to point out one more thing. You couldn't actually see it with this particular phrase, that I can also, if I choose, desynchronize the punch-in and punch-out points and set them independently of the loop. So now I'll start recording here, and the punch-in and punch-out will be set specifically to bars 33 and 37 respectively. Great. Sometimes when I'm composing, I record various types of effects, and here I wanted to show you one more function. Let's say I select another track and play something. And I didn't press record. As a way around this, all you need to do is quickly press record, and look what happens now. Now the program, I'm not sure if you'll be able to see this clearly, allows me to extend this track backwards. So it's a fantastic feature. I can now place it wherever I like. Actually, maybe I won't move it for now because we'll deal with audio editing in a moment. And look, it's simply been recorded. Why did this happen? It happened because in the Preferences window, Edit Preferences, under the tab Record Audio, I set 10 seconds for audio pre-record seconds, so the program will record for as long as the time we set here. So if we set it to 60 seconds, the program will always record 60 seconds before we press the record button. A very nice feature. It's worth making use of it. Apply. OK, and now it simply remains active. Sometimes when I'm composing, I record different types of effects, and here I wanted to show you one more feature. Let's say, for example, that I decide to pick another track, and then I go ahead and play something else for you. And I didn't press record. There's a way around this. Just quickly hit record, and look what happens now. Now the program, I'm not sure if you can see it clearly, lets me expand this track backwards. So that's a fantastic feature. Now I can place it wherever I want. Actually, maybe I won't move it for now, since we'll get to audio editing in a moment. And as you can see, it was simply recorded. Why'd that happen? It happened because in the Preferences window, Edit Preferences, under the tab, Record Audio, I set 10 seconds for audio pre-record seconds, so the program will record for as long as the time we set here. So if we set it to 60 seconds, the program will always record 60 seconds before we hit the record button. It's a really cool feature. Definitely worth using. Apply. Okay. And now it just stays active. Sometimes when I'm composing, I record various types of effects, and here I wanted to show you one more feature. For example, let's say I select another track and play something, just as an example. And I didn't press record. There's a way around this. Just quickly press record and see what happens now. Now the program, I'm not sure if you'll be able to see this clearly, lets me expand this track backwards. So it's a fantastic feature. Now I can place it wherever I want. Actually, maybe I won't move it for now because we'll deal with audio editing in a moment. And as you can see, it was simply recorded. Why did this happen? It happened because in the Preferences window, when you go to Edit Preferences under the tab, for example, Record Audio. For example, I set 10 seconds for audio pre-record seconds. Please note that the program will record for as long as the time we set here. In other words, the recording duration will match the value you specify. So if we set it to 60 seconds, the program will always record 60 seconds before we press the record button. A very cool and incredibly useful feature. It's definitely worth using. Just apply, tap OK, and now it simply remains enabled and running in the background. But I haven't discussed the post-roll function yet, which can sometimes be useful if, for example, you want to stop playback of the project after recording ends, but only after some time has passed since the recording finished. It sounds rather complicated, but it's actually quite simple, so I'll set the punch in and punch out points for this area. And I don't want the recording to end immediately after it's finished, so on the transport bar, I need to specifically and carefully find this element, pre-roll and post-roll. So I'll set the post-roll, for example, to 3 bars. And if I now select in the Preferences window, that is Edit Preferences, this function in the Record Audio window, actually record stop after automatic punch out, that's the function. Then the stop will occur, but after those 3 bars that are specified here. Let's check if this works, because it's hard to explain. It's easier to show. Maybe I'll also enable punch-in. And the program stopped playback by itself, but not immediately after the recording ended, rather after those 3 bars. All these functions that I'm discussing right now are, of course, available in the transport section. Punch in, punch out, etc. So it's worth taking a look at these functions, seeing what's available, and simply deciding what we want to use. Finally, a few words about files and where they're stored. Take a look. All recordings can be found in the pool window. Just a reminder, Ctrl-P This window is opened with the Ctrl+P shortcut, and here in the audio section you'll find all the recordings. If we've named the tracks then right away. These recordings will be visible here with consecutive numbers. If I hadn't named these tracks, they would have generic names like Audio 1, Audio 02, Audio 03, and so on. Files that I recorded but removed from the arrangement are in the trash, but they still physically exist on the disk until I delete them, so I won't choose the empty trash option yet. I can delete these media files only from this pool window, or I can also delete them permanently. So it's worth knowing about this and being careful. Until I finish working on the project, I usually don't empty this bin. I leave everything here, and all the recordings I use in the project are visible in this section. Before I talk more about how to trim clips, edit them, copy, or duplicate, I want to show you ways to select them for editing. Let's start by reminding you of a few functions from previous videos. I'll hide the view of this bottom window, the mixer window, using the button in the top right corner, which is the Show Hide Lower Zone button, or with the shortcuts Ctrl-Alt-E or Ctrl-Alt-B. And I'll zoom in. The view of all tracks to fit the entire arrangement window. To do this, I'll use the magnifier hidden under the number 6 key, so I'll select this whole area and also press Shift+F to align the view and stretch it to fill the entire arrangement window. Now I can show you how to select clips. Before I start selecting clips for editing, I'll make sure that the Object Selection tool, Normal Sizing, is chosen from the toolbar. In other words, just the cursor arrow. Yes. If you see a different symbol here, it might be because a different mode is selected. So it's a good idea to press the 1 key again so that the arrow simply appears here. And that's how you can select clips. Just use the mouse and click with the left button. You can also select multiple different clips at the same time by using the Shift key on your keyboard, just like this, for example. In addition, you can do exactly the same thing by simply holding down the Shift key and then carefully selecting a larger area of clips. It works the same way with the Control key, but there's a slight difference. If, for example, you select several clips with the Shift or Control key, and then, while holding Control, select a larger area that includes the previously selected clips, the selection will simply be inverted. So it's good to know about this. When you use the Shift key, the entire area will just be selected. Clicking on. Clicking in an empty area, a space where there is no recording, will deactivate the selection. To select all clips, you can also use the keyboard shortcut Ctrl-A, and to deselect, use Ctrl-Shift+A. The methods of selection with the Shift and Control keys that we just discussed apply to entire clips, but what if we want to select only a part? For this, we need to choose the Range Selection tool from the toolbar, which is available under the number 2 key. And now we can select not only entire clips, but also their fragments. And as you can see, this selection is subject to the rules of the snap function, which is the snapping feature that we activate using this button or the J key on the keyboard. And now this grid, I'll talk about the other options in a different video. It refers to bars. So here we have the bar option, meaning a measure. And this is the most useful function when it comes to building arrangements, because this way we can select fairly large sections, for example, to move them or to duplicate them with the Alt key, but I'll talk more about that later in this course. If you want to select a specific beat, for example, it's a good idea to choose the Use Quantize function from the list and specify what kind of quantization or alignment and arrangement you want to work with. As you can see, here are units up to even the 28th bar, including triplet and dotted note values. So if we want to mark, for example, a single beat, we can do it by choosing Use Quantize and selecting a suitably small unit. Among the options here, however, you'll also find Adapt to Zoom, and that might be the golden mean, because with it, when you're zoomed out far in the arrangement view, almost like from a bird's eye view, you can still select sections by bars. This way, for example, we can select a larger area of the arrangement, copy it, or move it, and at the same time, by zooming in closely, we can make surgical changes, just like I'm doing right now. So this is an option that might come in handy. However, when working on the arrangement, Shift-F, I'll stick with the bar function. Additional functions related to selection can be found in the Edit Select menu. But before I get into that, I wanted to show you that these functions work a bit differently depending on whether you choose Object Selection from this menu, remember that's the number 1 key, or Range Selection. So let's start with Object Selection. So the first function in Edit Select is the All function. The shortcut is Control-A, which selects everything in the arrangement window. We can also easily deselect everything. Select None. It works similarly with the Range Selection tool, which is available as the second option in Edit. Select All, except this time we see the selection in this form, which also lets us edit it quite easily and conveniently. Additionally, we have control over the specific area that we want to keep selected, allowing us to make adjustments as needed. This makes the editing process much more flexible and user-friendly overall. The next function in the Edit Select menu is only available for the Object Selection tool, and this function is called Edit Select Invert. Look, if I had some clips already selected in the arrangement, let's say, for example, these particular clips right here, the ones that contain the bass recording, then by using the Edit menu and choosing the Select option, followed by the Invert command, I can easily invert that selection. Selection works a bit differently in the loop area, specifically meaning the area marked by the left and right locators. In other words, the area covered by this bracket. Look, with Object Selection, Edit Select in loop selects the clips in their entirety. However, after choosing the Range Selection tool, the Edit Select in loop function only covers that specific fragment. So now I can move this fragment, for example, somewhere further along, for instance, to duplicate it and build my arrangement this way. I press Shift-F and Control-Shift-A. Another very useful function is Edit Select from Start to Cursor. See, now the entire area from the very beginning of the arrangement up to the cursor has also been selected, and we can easily edit it as well. Now I press the Shift key and clicked somewhere here around bar 9 in the arrangement window. Next option. This is the opposite option, Edit, Select from Cursor to End. And here, the entire arrangement is selected all the way to the end. In this case, the end means the end of the project. Project Setup, shortcut Shift-F. And as you can see, that end is basically at 5 minutes and 36 seconds. I press Shift-F. Sometimes it's also useful to select all events on a chosen track. Let's say the bass track, especially if the arrangement is already quite long and complicated. Take a look. Edit, select, all on selected tracks. Of course, if I selected more tracks, for example like this, then the selection could include everything on the selected tracks. So this is also a really cool and useful feature. What's more, the previously mentioned functions like edit, select, from start to cursor will now apply only to the selected tracks. If the cursor happens to be positioned somewhere in the middle of such a selection, it can also be conveniently used to cut the selected content. Take a look at how this works. Edit, select, and now I choose left selection side to cursor. Press the E key. Basically, I thought the left side would be selected, but the right side was selected instead, so it's kind of the opposite. Edit, select, right selection side to cursor. Now, the left side will probably be selected, as long as the selection actually includes something to the left of the cursor. So, right selection side to cursor covers the left part. That's basically everything. The remaining functions relate to the editor, so I won't be discussing them now. And now, tips and tricks, the cursor keys. Look, up and down let me move between tracks, but when I click or press the right arrow, the clip on that track will be selected. If I press the left arrow, it will be deselected. It's the same on the bass track. To the right, and I select the next clips using the right and left arrow keys. If I hold down the Shift key while doing this, I can select all of them. What's more, this way I can also select clips across multiple tracks. I hold Shift and press the down arrows. So this can also be a useful and quick function that you can use in editing. This is a very important episode because I want to clearly demonstrate to you just how very easy and extremely precise it is to modify or edit clips in Cubase, including editing multiple clips at once, how to duplicate them, how to move them very precisely, shift them, or synchronize them with each other. So we'll talk about all of that in just a moment. I'm undoing this operation, and let's start from the beginning. Let's start with trimming. Select to shorten the clip from the left side. To trim it from the left, just grab the lower left corner of the clip and drag it. The same goes for the right side, of course. You can see that the clip doesn't end exactly at bar 39, so I can grab it and drag it so it doesn't just cut off a moment later. It also works in a similar way to selecting according to the strict grid, that is, the grid function, which right now involves snapping the bars. However, sometimes it happens that we don't want to shorten the clip so that it ends exactly at the end of a specific bar, but instead want to do it manually, with precision. In that case, you can simply press and hold the Control key on your keyboard and then make such a cut without syncing to the rhythmic grid or any other snapping, effectively disabling the snap function. If you now want to create a fade out, just grab the top right corner of the clip. Interestingly, all these operations can be performed simultaneously on multiple selected clips. Look, I can also apply this fade to this clip now. When editing voiceover recordings and effects, the function of shifting the waveform, moving the recording within the clip, is often very useful. So let's say we want this clip to start at the beginning of this bar, but we want to shift its content. To do this, you need to press Ctrl and Alt, and then drag the clip, and that's it. The cursor in Cubase operates in 3 modes. In the normal sizing mode, which I showed a moment ago, but also in the sizing moves content mode, where resizing causes its content to shift, and in the mode where resizing changes the tempo or pitch depending on the selected mode. So let's first check out the sizing moves content mode. Let me just remind you that you can also, if you prefer, simply double-click the button labeled 1 in order to get this exact same icon to appear. And now, please notice that if I want to scale this particular clip, I'll actually be shifting its content so it will end exactly at the point that I said earlier. Of course, the limit is the length of the clip itself. This is really useful, for example, when matching effects, well, working on syncing audio to video. So if I wanted, for instance, To move this effect here, I can do it just like that. If I wanted this effect to start at this beat, I just move it from this side. Very easy, very simple, very effective. In sizing applies time stretch mode, you can stretch clips over time. I'll show you this with a short example. I select the range selection tool, carefully move a drum section to the very end of the track, and now watch what happens next. How easily you can stretch this clip in time. So again, I switch to the appropriate mode and stretch my drum track over time. By default, this stretching is governed by the Elastic Pro algorithm, which matches the settings in the Preferences window. You can find these settings in the Edit Preferences tab, in the Editing Audio section. Right here, Default Warping Algorithm. For harmonic or melodic recordings, it's worth trying the pitch mode. Here, we have the option to preserve transients, and the efficient mode lets us save on computer processing power. So I don't recommend the standard modes. I recommend using the slightly more demanding but definitely better sounding Elastic Pro modes instead. You can also edit clips in the info line row. Notice that when I select a clip for editing, a ton of information appears in the top row, starting with the clip name, the name of this particular take, its start and end points, length, fade in, fade out, volume, transposition, as well as the available or default mode for time stretching this specific clip. If that top row is not visible, you need to bring it up from the Window View menu. Here, in the top right corner, there's a button with a gear symbol and the label Set Up Window Layout. It's specifically about this option, Info Line. The starting point for moving clips and changing their placement can also be the grid settings themselves, meaning these settings here. Notice how many different options are available here. And so, by default, clips are moved, copied, and duplicated according to the grid constraint, in this case with bar resolution. So each move is simply one bar, unless I press the Control key, as I showed earlier. But you can also choose the grid relative option. What is it useful for? Let's say you have a clip that, for example, doesn't start at the beginning of the bar, but a little later. For example, right here. In that case, you won't want to move it so that it starts at the beginning of the bar, but rather in a way that preserves that offset, that gap. To do this, you need to select the grid relative option, and then that offset, that shift, is preserved every time you move that particular clip. Another useful option is snapping to events. So, for example, if you want subsequent files, let's say some words, voiceover recordings, to be joined together in such a way that there are no gaps between them, you can select this option. Then the recordings will snap right to the clips. See, it works the same way here, without any unnecessary pauses. The next option is Shuffle. Now I'll select these few bass tracks for editing. And let's say I want this first clip, this one, to be moved to a later position. If the Shuffle function is selected, I can, for example, set its position here relative to the other clips. So this green line shows me where the clip will appear. I'm simply swapping these clips places. Additionally, in the menu, you'll also find the option to snap to the cursor. Let's say, for example, that you found a key moment in the film you're adding sound to. Then you can simply snap the event to the cursor. It works both ways, because you can also snap a clip so that it fades out right here. However, and here's a note, pay attention, it didn't work this time, and that's because every clip has a set snap point. This is also a pretty important detail. This point is called snap, set event snap, and it doesn't have to be placed at the beginning of the clip. In most clips, that's exactly how it will be, and you can see it here in the settings for each of these clips. The snap point is at the beginning. But in this particular clip, which started recording in bar 26, I stretched the clip backward in retrospective mode So the snap point is here. So to align this clip or its end, you would need to set the snap point, for example, here. Now it should work. For example, I set it here, there you go, and I snapped it into place. I could also set that point at the beginning, and then I'd be able to snap it this way. Besides that, we also have combinations of these modes available, like grid-proof cursor or events plus cursor, a very useful feature. It's worth remembering, especially if you're editing audio for films. These are simply tools that significantly speed up your workflow, and that's also an advantage of Cubase as a program, a system for post-production of audio for video. Ahead of us is another important episode, in which I'll show you some pretty crucial features related to arranging. This time, the arrangement is made from parts played using this very synthesizer. Here's our arrange lead. So let's take a closer look. I'll play a fragment of it for you. So, first of all, as you can see, you can simply move clips around, and this works according to the grid settings, which I mentioned earlier. The grid function is activated with the J key. We can also easily move or copy other elements. Let me remind you, I'd like to copy this element. I can do this simply by pressing Ctrl-C and wherever the cursor is now. It'll be copied there, but notice what happened. It was copied onto the track that is currently active. So we need to stay on the same track. There you go. If the clips overlap, of course the one on top will play, but I can press X to create an automatic fade and adjust that fade if needed. I can also easily create duplicate tracks, and that's what I want to show you now. Let's say I wanted to create a duplicate of, for example, this track here. Let's say that I'll press Ctrl-D. I can also do this using keyboard shortcuts. Look, I press Ctrl-C and on the same track, Ctrl-V, or by dragging while holding Alt. Very important, you have to start dragging first and only then press Alt and a copy will be created. If you wanted to create at the same time, there's also a way to make more copies at once. Look, it's actually very easy. You can just drag the clip like this by clicking, I'm not sure if you can see it well, grabbing it right here in the middle and dragging it. There you go. Now we have a perfect large number of copies. Alternatively, if we prefer, we can press Ctrl-D a number of times, like this, or use the Ctrl-K function, which will make the program ask us how many copies to create. Let's say 15. There you go. The program has created 15 copies. I'm undoing this operation. That's a lot. And of course, copying a larger number of clips works the same way. Let's say we want to copy this entire section, for example. We can select it, press Ctrl-C, Ctrl-V, and it'll be copied, but starting from the track that is selected. We have to do it this way. And it'll be pasted exactly where the cursor is. It'll be different in the case of the Range tool, which you activate by pressing 2. Here, we not only have to click Copy, but also select the area where we want to paste the recording. So if I start selecting from this measure, this area will also be pasted starting from that exact measure. Let's see. It was pasted. It didn't work. 1 second. Ctrl-C. There you go. I have to select here and press Ctrl-V. So as you can see, it's exactly at the beginning of the measure I indicated here. Of course, I can move it if something isn't right. So that's how it works. And of course, duplicating with Ctrl-D works the same way here. I can also use Ctrl-K for this. And this way, I can create an arrangement very quickly by simply copying and pasting. Let's go back to the original arrangement. If you want to carefully relocate a clip while keeping its relative position, not to the beginning of the bar, but maintaining its exact placement, remember to enable the grid relative function. And this is especially useful when you're copying on the same track, because if you want to copy a given clip, a clip of the same type, to another track, you can do that as well. In grid relative mode, or in grid mode, simply by pressing the Control key. It's a really cool feature, but there's yet another way. You can select a given clip and then simply and easily copy it using the command functions paste relative to cursor to your project. There you go. And it was also copied to the same spot on another track. Here, the move to select a track command can also come in handy. So again, I'm going to the Edit menu. Here we have the whole palette of comment move to select a track. So this time it will be moved, not duplicated, to this track while keeping its relative position, even though the grid relative option wasn't enabled. I've covered the basic methods of moving, copying, and duplicating clips, including using the normal sizing, sizing moves content tools, and time stretching algorithms for scaling. I also showed how to mark larger areas of the arrangement using the Range tool, which is available under the number 2 shortcut. So now, let's discuss the tools for cutting, joining, and deleting. These are available under the 3, 4, and 5 keys on the keyboard. The tool available under the number 5 key simply lets us delete clips by clicking on them. We can also select larger areas, for example like this, click within one of them, and all of them will be deleted. The Scissors tool, available under the number 3 key, works in a very predictable way. You just click and cut, and this cutting happens right now, as you can see, according to the rules of the snap function, meaning it aligns with the rhythmic grid set to bar accuracy. Of course, we can turn off the snap function by pressing the yaw key or unchecking this button here. However, I suggest keeping snap to 0 crossing enabled so we can cut at points where the waveform crosses the axis. This helps precisely isolate, for example, individual drum hits without risking clicks at their beginnings or ends, something I'll discuss more in another episode. We can also easily join clips together, even if there's a gap between them. So maybe I'll turn on the snap function, move this bass a few bars over, and look, now I select this area and grab the glue tool number 4, so all I have to do is mark these clips like this. I can also join them together this way. And look, now something like an audio region has been created, so if I press the 1 key on the keyboard, or go back to the Object Selection tool and double-click within this clip, you'll notice that it appears in the editor as a region. And here I can edit just like before in the Arrangement window. At the same time, in the Arrangement window, I have access to this bigger block, which I can easily move as a whole. So it's also a really cool and convenient feature. Clips can also be edited from the Info line row, which is this row here. Here you'll find a range of important information such as, for example, the file name, which you can change here, the start point of a given clip, so you can also move clips this way. If, for example, you want the clip placed exactly at bar 100, just enter 100 here. This is useful for various post-production tasks. We can also shorten a clip or group of clips, for example, to 2 bars if we want, change the fade in and fade out settings, or, for example, lower the volume by a specific value, for instance by 6 decibels. In the so-called subtractive approach to building an arrangement, the Mute tool, which is used for muting clips, can also help us. How does it work? After selecting it using this button or the number 7 key on your keyboard, you can simply click on a clip and it'll be muted. It remains in the arrangement window, but it does not play back. So, for example, we can use this to build up the arrangement in this way. Let's suppose, for the sake of this example, that we create some regions right here in this section that we want to use in order to build the arrangement. Now, let's say I decide to copy this region, for example, and move it further down the timeline using Ctrl-J. I'll duplicate this clip, let's say a total of 7 times, just to demonstrate how this process works in practice. There you go. I've created 7 copies, and now I'll add some baselines to this, for example. Starting here, this time I'll press Ctrl-D, and here, for example, I'll paste in some chords, which I'll also duplicate. Ctrl-D. Now, using this tool under number 7, I can, for example, decide to start with the chords and only bring in the drums after a while. Then I'll only bring in the bass, but only later on. And for example, this bass entry will be, the bass will come in without the drums, so we'll play it like this. So there are quite a lot of possibilities for this kind of subtractive arrangement building. You can also use this tool for that. One of the editing techniques you'll definitely want to master is overlaying and blending clips. I'll show you this using the example of this effect. Let's listen to it, maybe in solo mode. Let's say I want to copy this clip. So I click, drag, and now I press the Alt key. And the program creates for me a copy of it which overlays the previous clip. And of course, at this point, playback of the first clip will be interrupted because the second one is overlapping it. If I want the first one to stay on top, I need to use a specific command option from the Edit menu in the software application. It's located right here. Edit, Move. To front, the letter U. It's worth remembering this shortcut. It might come in handy. There's also the option to collapse the view of this particular clip. Now, if there were more clips, let's say I copy it again, so I grab, drag, and hold down the Alt key like this, then this little arrow here can be useful. You can choose which clip is on top at any given moment. If you're already sure about their placement, you can remove the overlapping, that is, use Remove Overlaps. This kind of function is available here in every case. But in most situations like this, you'll probably want these clips to overlap. Now I'll show you how to do that. I'm undoing those editing steps. So when I copy this clip in such a way that it overlaps with its previous version, it's best to create a crossfade. All you have to do is press the X key when one of these clips is selected, and the program will create a smooth crossfade, which you can adjust. You can also move it from one side or the other, especially if you hold down the Control key, which lets you do it quite smoothly. Let's listen to how it sounds now. This crossfade probably isn't perfect. If we want it to be absolutely perfect, we can make extremely precise edits in the crossfade window with great care. All you need to do is open it by double-clicking in the crossfade area. As you can see, this menu appears, and now I can drag this clip as well as edit the crossfade itself. By default, it's symmetrical, but I can unlink this function, and then, for example, I can make this clip fade out for quite a long time and, for example, do it in a logarithmic way, while this one, for instance, could ramp up quickly. Let's see. Let's try it this way then. Also, notice that we have a pre-roll and post-roll function here. We can enable it, set a 1-second lead-in, and listen to how the fade-out sounds. I think the fade-in actually sounds exceptionally smooth enough. And how does the whole crossfade sound? Maybe with a brief 2-second pre-roll, for example, that lead-in, and then approximately 2 seconds of playback after the end. I think now it sounds perfect. There are a lot of features here. We can really fine-tune the crossfade. These buttons here let us choose the function. At the moment, this is a pretty angular curve. Here, we have different ways of interpolation, so it's worth playing around a bit. But usually, the functions available here are more than enough in 99% of cases. That's about it. There's also, of course, the useful auto-zoom function, so you can really do this very, very precisely. In the arrangement, it looks like this, and it sounds like this. Let's listen to it in context then.
still I'm in la 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 la, loving you. Don't wanna love you, somebody help me out.